Chapter 292. Brendel was stunned when he saw the tears rolling down Scarlett's cheeks. "What's wrong?" The girl let her tears fall as if she didn't hear him and only reacted after a while. She sniffed to calm her emotions and finally realized that she had lost her composure. Her cheeks flushed red. "It's nothing. It's too painful." Scarlett turned her head away and answered reluctantly, "My lord." Brando felt like crying in his heart. Isn't this excuse a little too clumsy? Does it look like she's crying because she's in too much pain? It's more appropriate to say that she's trying to hide her panic. He wasn't an idiot and could roughly guess what she was thinking. Even though he didn't know what she thought of the Grey Wolves mercenaries, Makarov, and himself, he could see that her silence couldn't hide her avoidance of the past. Rather than saying that she had accepted everything, it was more like she was still stuck in her memories. She seemed to have an instinctive fear and distrust of the outside world. If she left everything she was familiar with, she would be surrounded by a great sense of isolation. He did not know what she had experienced in the past, but he knew that the maned wolf Makarov's actions must have caused great harm to her. "Can you stand up?" He threw those thoughts away and asked. Scarlett nodded weakly, but she tried a few times. Even though she was holding Brando's hand, the pain was so intense that she couldn't help but whimper and kneel down. Brando saw the red-haired girl grit her teeth as she cried and tried her best to stand up. He couldn't bear to see her like this. Even though he had seen women cry before, but compared to the girls in the game who had tears in their eyes, Scarlett's strength was more admirable. Moreover, he was a man after all. "Don't hold on anymore, I'll carry you," Brando said. They couldn't stay here for too long. Even though they didn't know the situation of Coden and Medisha who were sealed on the other side, they couldn't stay here for too long. However, if the old man returned to the surface before them, their mission would be a complete failure. They had to race against time. "How can I?" Scarlett was stunned. What kind of lord would do such a thing? Perhaps Makarov would do something like that, but she knew that it was to buy people's hearts, just like how the Grand Commander did not care about her in the past. She did not understand why, and no matter how well she did, she would never get as much attention as Eek. But later on, she finally understood that even if you wanted to buy people's hearts, you still needed to have the qualifications to be bought. Of course, Scarlett wouldn't be jealous of the person she loved, but she couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. A guy who didn't even have the strength of a silver rank might not even be as good as Rady in the eyes of the captain. Thinking of the white-haired young man who had been killed by Brando, the red-haired girl couldn't help but feel a wave of disgust. But what was the young lord's purpose? She didn't have any strength left and didn't have any reputation among the remaining members of the Grey Wolves mercenaries. She was even weaker than Sanford. She had to admit that she was not as beautiful as the merchant girl who was announced to be his fiancée. Brando only had physical contact with the latter, let alone her. "There's no need." She thought for a moment and shook her head. "My lord, you should leave first. You can come and save me after you control the mine." She paused for a moment and said hesitantly, "I'm a mercenary, and I won't be too scared alone. At most, my lord, please leave me a piece of illuminating crystal." Brando didn't know whether to laugh or cry as he looked at the fear written all over her face. It was still a problem whether they could find a way out, but even if they were lucky, it would take at least a few hours for them to return. Leaving a defenseless girl like her alone was not dangerous, and the most important thing was that she might turn into an angel the moment he left her. But he thought for a moment and didn't say it directly. Instead, he replied tactfully, "You've lost too much blood. It's dangerous for you to stay here." "It's fine," the red-haired girl shook her head, "this is also Lady Martha's will. Besides, there's no need for you to bring a burden with you." She paused for a moment and her voice became weak. "Actually, thank you, my lord. It's enough that you don't want to leave Scarlett behind." The girl took a deep breath and forced a smile. "So I can't be selfish, right?" Brando was stunned when he heard this. He looked at Scarlet's beautiful amber eyes. There was even a trace of mist in them, but in the end, they were still dim and lifeless. He suddenly understood. Such an outstanding girl wouldn't have met such a fate if she was born in Wound. But did Wound ever have a peaceful life? The reason why the Amber Sword set this world to be one of strife and turbulence was because a game needed a turbulent environment to write an epic chapter. But what was an epic? For this world, it was nothing more than flames burning the earth, bones piling up, and rivers of blood flowing. In Wound, where the borders of civilization were constantly being nibbled away, wars became more frequent. Because of the need for survival, on one hand, humans became more collective, but on the other hand, they became more utilitarian and practical. The consequence was that the existence of the individual became insignificant. The warmth between people had long disappeared, and the whole society was filled with a sense of coldness when it was formed, cold and efficient. Although in Erewhon, there was more and more resistance because of the incompetent nobles holding the ruling power of the country, but this resistance was not to overthrow the system of this world. In the end, it was because the people at the bottom generally doubted the legitimacy of the ruler. This legitimacy had nothing to do with blood or birth, and the only criterion was strength. The strong were respected, and the weak seemed to be left to fend for themselves. As a modern person, Brando did not object to the former, but he did not agree with the latter. He knew that Scarlet's story was not unique in this world. There were thousands of Scarlets in this world, just like how there were thousands of Sifrids. If not for him, the little girl from the Green Village would not have ended up any better than the red-haired girl in front of him. Was it not? In fact, there were many people in this world who were more unfortunate than them. He was powerless to change all of this. This was different from changing the fate of Erewhon. It was a rebellion against the will of the world itself. This will not only represented the power of a huge society, but also the laws of nature that formed this power. After all, this was a different world from Earth. Brando's selfish wish was to save the kingdom. As for whether this wish would hurt more people, he did not think too much about it. These people might come from other countries, such as Madara, Cruz, or even the oppression of the kingdom itself. Brando only hoped that the people he was familiar with, whether it was the princess, the Valkyrie, or the people who sacrificed their lives for the kingdom, would not repeat the tragedy that happened to them. Rewriting history, that was all. When a tragedy like Scarlet's happened, he did not think that he could turn a blind eye to it. When Brando heard Scarlet's words, he shook his head and said, "You're thinking too much. Do you think I'm such a useless person?" But Scarlet was still hesitating. An excellent leader will never leave any of his members behind. Brando felt that he should say something cool like this at this moment. He remembered that this sentence was told to him by his senior sister when she handed the team over to him. But he found that he could not be serious at all. In the end, he could only shake his head and make a clumsy joke. "Don't worry, I won't take advantage of you." But Brando was about to cry when he said this. He felt that he had embarrassed himself as a transmigrator. Scarlet was not any better. Her face was completely red, and she quickly shook her head. "Of course not, it's just, no, it's just." Brando felt that he would go crazy if he continued talking. He simply carried Scarlet with both hands without saying a word, completely ignoring the latter's frightened cry. She was dumbfounded. She never dreamed that Brando would be so forceful. Her mind was in a mess. He just said that he won't take advantage of me. But the girl immediately buried her head in her chest like an ostrich. Her ears were red, and her heart was thumping. She could not say a word. She wondered if this was the legendary Princess Carrie. When she was in the mercenary group, she had wondered more than once if Eek would carry her to the Holy Cathedral one day. But this little extravagant hope had long since turned into a beautiful fantasy after Yura appeared. But this red-haired girl never thought that one day, someone would really carry her like this. It was just that this person wasn't the one she had imagined, and the pitch-black tunnel seemed a little too eerie. But when she leaned her head against Brando's chest like an ostrich, she felt an inexplicable sense of security even though her heart was beating fast. My lord is different from most people I've met. She thought, he's also different from Eek. When I'm by his side, I feel a strange sense of security and trust. This feeling is probably the same for Amandina, and the Roman lady as well. They should all be able to feel it. Scarlett suddenly understood why there were more and more people gathering around Brando in the past few months. Although this was not unrelated to the young man's personal ability, there were many people in Wonde who had more background and ability than him. But today, she finally found the reason. She lightly clicked her tongue, thinking that she was lucky to be able to follow such a lord. It seemed that Lady Martha had not completely abandoned her. But the prospect of losing her power still made her feel a little gloomy. She knew that she was not a genius, and it would not be easy to regain her power. But she shook her head and threw this thought away. She would just take it one day at a time. Brando's every move had made her completely relieved. But when she thought this, she did not know that she only had a few days or even a few hours to live. P.S. If you're in a situation where your results are good, you really don't want to ask for support. Chapter 293. The two of them walked in the dark tunnel, with only the dim light from the illuminating crystals illuminating the path ahead. The collapse did not only happen in the area where they fought. Brando saw signs of the collapse everywhere. Piles of earth and rocks blocked most of the tunnel. Some places were completely blocked off. Even though he could break through the rocks in these places, he still chose to take a detour in order to not cause a second collapse. Scarlett leaned on Brando's body, clearly feeling the young lord's strong heartbeat. She felt her own heart pounding as well. The red-haired girl's face was a little hot. She felt that she should say something to break the awkward silence, but she did not know where to start. She thought for a while and decided to change the topic. Where are the others? Brando shook his head. He remembered that he, Scarlett, Coden, and Metasha were separated. Yuta was even further away, and he did not know where she was now. He searched for Metasha's card in his mind. The silver card did not turn gray, which meant that the silver elf princess was not in any danger. I'm not sure, but it doesn't seem like a big problem. He recalled that when the collapse happened, Metasha and Coden were sealed together. Since she was not in danger, it was very likely that Coden was in trouble. Brando knew that Metasha alone was no match for Coden. Scarlett replied. Is your wound okay? Brando asked. He was worried that the red-haired girl was suddenly so talkative. He was worried that the blood of God would act up prematurely. No, Scarlett quickly changed the topic, but it's a little strange. What's wrong? We had just started fighting. Now that I think about it, it didn't seem like it would cause such a large earthquake. Brando fell silent. In fact, he had been wondering about this ever since he woke up. Although it was dangerous for 4 gold-tier fighters to fight in the mine, they had only fought a few times. Other than his first White Raven sword style, he had not used any other powerful skills. Even if he was a gold-tier swordsman, he would be no different from an ordinary person. It was not as if such a person would cause an earthquake when he walked into the mines. It was just that he didn't have time to think too much about it back then. Now that he looked back, he found many suspicious points. He wondered if he was unlucky enough to encounter an earthquake. If that was the case, then Lady Martha's joke was a bit too much. However, regardless of whether it was an earthquake or not, this doubt could only remain at the level of speculation for now. They could only come to a conclusion after they reached the ground and learned how big the impact of the collapse was. But now, Brando had no choice but to weave through the dark, crisscrossing underground tunnels like a mole. As time passed, he began to suspect that the area he was in had been sealed off. However, when he came to a dead end for the third time, Brando finally confirmed it. However, after such a long search, it was not all for naught. At least he found out that the elevator he used to go up to this floor could still be used. The only bad news was that the elevator could only go up to the 4th floor. The 4th floor of the mine was connected to the 3rd floor, but the 5th floor was connected to the beehive. It was a complicated cave system, and from there, one could enter the 4th floor. Perhaps, one could enter the 3rd floor from another area. Brando had asked Joka before he entered the mine. There were a total of 5 elevators from the 3rd to the 4th floor. Although the area he was in was sealed off by the falling rocks, the other areas on the 3rd floor might not be the same. He made a decision in a short time and brought Scarlet to the 4th floor to try his luck. The elevator hit the rock and stopped with a heavy thud. Brando was no stranger to this floor of the mine. In fact, he came up from here before. The 4th floor was also dark, but under the light of the illuminating crystal, Brando immediately noticed that the 4th floor had also collapsed. He looked up at the loose rock at the top of the tunnel and the dirt on the ground. However, the rock here was more solid, so the tunnel suffered less damage than the previous one. Brando was more and more confused. He was more and more certain that the earthquake he encountered before was a coincidence. But how could there be such a coincidence? If this was really an earthquake, then it should have happened in the Amber Sword in the past. In the game, Tonajul was considered a low-level area in the transition to a mid-level area. Based on the game's timeline, some players should have just arrived here. He couldn't help but recall the posts related to the earthquake. These posts should be more common in Erewhon, but they were relatively rare in Erewhon. Something like this should have left an impression in his memory. But when he thought about it, he couldn't remember seeing any posts related to it on the forum. But he suddenly remembered something. There was indeed something related to Tonajul on the forum during this period. It was a strange post. Brando remembered that the post was a post asking for an appraisal. The appraisal was cold iron ore and 2 other unknown items. When the words cold iron ore flashed through Brando's mind, it immediately alerted him. He immediately recalled the title of the post. He remembered that the title of the post was, "A large number of cold iron ore for sale," and also asking to appraise 2 items that have never been seen before. To be honest, there were at least 800, if not 1,000, posts like this on the forum during that era. After all, players had only been in the game for a few months, and there were too many new things that the players had not seen before. It was difficult for Brando to remember such a post. But in that era when players did not have any high-level materials, the sudden appearance of a large number of cold iron ore made this post popular. At that time, some people even doubted the authenticity of this post, but it also made Brando remember this post. But his memory of this post was quite vague. He had already forgotten most of the main post's content. He could only vaguely remember that the poster seemed to have received a mission, and then found 2 strange items in a cold iron ore vein when he was mining. As for why he accepted the mission to mine, Brando could not remember. But he remembered the strange items clearly. The first item was the diagonal quartz. That was the first time the magic A stone appeared on the forum as a material. And the second item, from the picture, he remembered that it was a silver bowl. In the end, the discussion of this item did not reach a conclusion. But it did not disappear from the public sight. In fact, later on, there were people who found and learned about the origin of this silver ball from other places. Silver Legacy. In the Pale poem of the Cruz people, there was an era before the Age of Chaos, before Martha created the world. It was called the Age of Dusk. Legend has it that in that ancient era, there were gold and silver people living in the Age of Chaos, and there were even legendary, divine people. There was a saying that Martha was one of the divine people, but there was another saying that Martha was created by the divine people. But what kind of existence the divine people were was long unknown. In fact, except for ancient myths like the Pale poem, they had never appeared in the world of the Amber Sword. Even the widely spread bards on the continent, and most of the half-true rumors were not mentioned in the slightest. So, similar to how Martha was referred to as a reference to the rules, the divine people were referred to as a reference to reality. Players usually thought that the divine people referred to the game designer. So, in contrast to Martha's half-reality and half-virtual existence, the divine people should be completely realistic and synonymous with non-existent in the game. But one thing was very clear. Historical records did say that the divine people led the first gold and silver generation to create the first sage's sanctuary. Then, Martha used these points to create the world of Wound with the support of the elemental code. The formation of the world took a long time. The first gold and silver people relied on the sanctuary to resist the attack of the Twilight Dragon. Until the last sanctuary recorded in history, the Babel of Babel, was destroyed. Then came the era when the gold and silver bloodlines were scattered across the land, which was the beginning of the Age of Chaos. History before and after that had been buried in the dust. The gold and silver bloodlines had also wandered the land for countless years and almost disappeared. But the ruins of the sanctuary were not completely destroyed. Just like the fairyland of the King of Knights that Brando led the refugees of Fortress Reden into when they fled, the ruins of the sanctuary were widespread in this world. Some were half-physical, such as hidden in the crevices of space and time, such as the fairyland. Some were completely imaginary, such as the legendary Babel of Babel, the unbreakable last fortress that existed at the top of the world. But there were also some that were the most physical, and most of these were the Silver Folk sanctuaries. These sanctuaries were the most thoroughly destroyed in the war. For example, the steel plains sunk into the ground, and the runic dwarves were almost wiped out. And some were left as ruins, becoming sacred places today. The most famous one that Brando knew was the Gate to Heaven in the Kingdom of Knights. But there were also some that were unknown, such as the Dusty Kingdom and Valhalla. But in any case, some of these shelters were not empty. Just like archaeology, people who entered could often find something inside. This was the legacy of the Gold people and the Silver people. In fact, the golden apple in Brando's hand was a kind of gold legacy. In terms of quality, although the legacy of the Silver folk was a little inferior, the effect would not be that bad. Thinking of this, Brando could already guess that the previous earthquake was completely likely caused by the magical resonance caused by the unearthing of the high-grade holy object. The magic eye gem, the cold iron ore, he had almost confirmed where this mission was. Just relying on the legacy of the Silver folk alone did not seem to be enough to cause such a big commotion. Brando was a little puzzled. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 294. Not long after they entered the 4th level, Brando suddenly heard Scarlet whisper, "My lord." "What's wrong?" "Let me try." The girl's voice was almost inaudible. Brando looked down and found that the body of an oracle was indeed worthy of its reputation. Although she had lost her strength, her body's recovery ability was still much stronger than the average person. Brando saw that the wound on her thigh had stopped bleeding and formed a scab. He hesitated for a moment and asked, "Is it okay?" But under the girl's insistence, Brando finally helped her down. Scarlet frowned slightly when her feet touched the ground, but after a while, she stood steadily. Although she was a little slow, she could barely walk by herself with the support of the lightning spear. After discovering this, Scarlet seemed to be a little happy. She happily raised her head and smiled at Brando. "My lord." Brando rarely saw such a heartfelt smile from Scarlet. He could not help but be slightly startled. But the latter quickly realized that she had lost her composure and turned her head away. Brando actually thought that the red-haired girl looked pretty when she smiled, but of course, he would never say that out loud. The two maintained their silence as they walked through the low tunnel. Not long after, Brando suddenly saw a faint white thing in the darkness ahead. He softly exclaimed in surprise. "What's wrong?" Scarlet asked from behind. "There seems to be something," Brando explained in a low voice. He knew that Scarlet's vision was no different from that of an ordinary person. In this environment, it was difficult to see far away. Although there was an illuminating crystal, the light was too bad. He pulled out his sword with one hand and slowly walked over with the girl. Finally, he saw that it was a person lying on the ground. It seemed to be a miner here. He carefully looked at the person and did not find any obvious wounds on his body. "He's not dead yet." Scarlet looked at the person and immediately judged. Brando also saw that the person's chest was rising and falling slightly. It seemed that he had just fainted. He nodded and tried to shout, but did not wake up. So he pulled out the cork on the water bag and flicked some water on the person's forehead. Considering that they did not know how long they would be trapped underground, and the amount of fresh water they had with them was limited, Brando subconsciously lightened his movements. Fortunately, his method worked quickly. The miner didn't seem to have suffered any injuries, and he quickly blinked and woke up. But as soon as it opened its eyes and saw the two of them, it subconsciously shrank back and crashed into the cold rock wall. Brando looked at his uneasy expression and hurriedly said, "We are also from here. You don't have to worry." The miner was stunned for a moment before he came to his senses. He took a deep breath and looked at the two of them carefully before he calmed down and asked, "Are you in charge? Supervisor? Or are they from the guards?" He saw Brando's sword and Scarlet's halberd. In this mine, only the supervisors and soldiers would carry weapons, but Brando and Scarlet were not wearing the guard's uniform, so they looked more like the latter. "We are from the guards." Brando knew that the miner knew almost every foreman, so he answered. The man was obviously relieved, but he quickly became nervous again. "Did you also encounter a monster?" He saw the blood on Scarlet's body. "Monster?" Brando looked back and exchanged glances with Scarlet. The monster here was probably the wind spirit spiders that he had summoned. But he frowned and asked, "What kind of monster?" Brando had used the wind spirit spiders to scout the way on the third floor, but Brando instinctively felt that things were not that simple. "Stone statue, a monster that looks like a stone statue." "Martha above. A monster that looks like a stone statue." Scarlet squatted down beside Brando and asked softly. "Stone statue." Brando thought that there were many monsters inwoven in the form of rocks, and the typical ones were the gargoyle sentinels and war golems made by the Bugle wizards. But considering the environment here, it was more likely that it was a stone elemental. Brando thought for a moment and comforted the miner, "Don't be afraid. We are here. Slowly think about what the monsters looked like. Were they humanoid? Or were they beast-shaped?" The miner took a deep breath and said, "They looked like beasts, but they were all made of rocks." "Sir, I swear I didn't see wrong. Beast-shaped. Did they have wings?" "No." The miner answered without hesitation. Brando was puzzled. He had never heard of such monsters in the form of rocks. Although there were many kinds of monsters and monsters inwoven, most of them could be traced back to their origins. For example, monsters in the form of soil and rocks were either magic golems or related to the earth elemental world. But except for the gargoyle sentinels, beast-shaped monsters were very rare. The creatures in the earth elemental world were mostly insect-shaped. But when he saw that the miner was suspicious again, he quickly calmed him down and asked, "Is there anyone else here other than you?" He knew that the miners usually entered the mine in groups. The miner gulped as if he just remembered something. He quickly nodded and said, "Yes," he said, "I came with my group, but we were separated when we encountered the monsters." He could not help but look into the depths of the cave and said with uncertainty, "I don't know where they went." I don't know if they are still alive. The monsters might have gone after them. He seemed to be relieved, but he was also a little scared. Right, the miners suddenly remembered something. Lord Mayhan is here too. Lord Mayhan. You don't know him. The miner was slightly stunned. He is the foreman of this area. I heard that he used to be in the army. His swordsmanship is very good. When the earthquake started, he said that he would go to the front to take a look, and then the monsters appeared. Brando was speechless. He almost let the cat out of the bag when he asked. Fortunately, the miner was not very vigilant when he saw his own people. But Scarlet frowned slightly. Didn't the collapse start in an instant when the earthquake started? Also, why did he go to the front to take a look? As someone who became a mercenary at a very young age, her way of thinking was much sharper than Brando's. Brando heard her and reacted, "You're right. Shouldn't he be looking for a safe place to hide?" No, 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 the miner quickly waved his hand. The earthquake wasn't that bad at first, and the rock layer below is relatively sturdy, so the collapse wasn't that bad. The thing is, the earthquake came from the south. Didn't you feel it? The earthquake came from the south. This unexpected information made Brando react. It seemed that his guess was not far from the truth. There was indeed something incredible that was dug out from the Schaflund mine. But even though he did not know them, he was still worried for Cohen and the other youths. They must be dead by now. Brando could not help but sigh. "It doesn't seem to be an earthquake," Scarlet whispered, "my lord." Brando had already made up his mind to go to the front to take a look. Even though the silver legacy was not as rare as the golden apple, it was still a rare item. But with such a valuable reward, the mission would not be so simple. He suddenly interrupted Scarlet and put a finger to his lips. Shh, the tunnel quieted down, and only the miner's heavy breathing could be heard. But soon, Scarlet and the miner heard a rustling sound coming from the south. It was as if something was moving close to the ground. "They're here." The miner's face turned pale in an instant. But Brendel put down his sword with some doubts in his heart. There were many things coming, but these slightly heavy footsteps didn't sound like they were anything powerful. But soon, the monsters that the miner spoke of appeared one by one. The first to appear was a gray-white feline. It gracefully stepped into the light of the illuminating crystal and stared at Brando with a pair of eyes that looked like gray gemstones. No, it should be said that it was a pair of gray gemstones. This was because the slender feline was actually a stone statue. A living stone statue with gray crystals as its eyes. Brando immediately understood when he saw this thing. It was not a monster in the form of a rock. It was a summoned creature. To be more precise, it was a creature formed from the earth elemental. As for what form it took, it was entirely up to the summoner's will. But Brando was slightly taken aback. "There's an elven summoner down there." This thought flashed through his mind. Or is there something controlling these creatures unconsciously? It seemed that the latter possibility was much more obvious. But if it was a piece of equipment with self-consciousness, even if it had no intelligence, it would be at least fantasy level or above. And it might even be an extremely high fantasy level. When Brando thought of this, he suddenly burst into tears. He thought that since he came to this world, he could finally see high-level equipment for the first time. As he thought of this, more and more felines appeared in the darkness. There were more than 10 of them, and there were a few pairs of shimmering eyes swaying beyond the boundary of light. More than 20 rock panthers had formed a semicircular encirclement around them. Brando did not panic at all. He stepped forward and put down his sword. "Stay back, Scarlet." Scarlet grabbed the miner, who was so scared that his legs went soft and was about to roll and crawl away. Then she turned back and nodded at Brando, and obediently stepped back a little. She knew that she did not have any power now. At most, she relied on her strength as an oracle to be slightly stronger than ordinary people. If she stayed on the front line, she could only interfere with Brando's actions. However, although she had lost her power, her vision was still there. She had already seen that these big rock panthers did not seem to be a threat, especially to Brando. On the 19th, my relative is getting married. I'm not sure if I'll be updating, but I'll make up for it if it's missing. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 295. However, Scarlet could understand the other party's strength, and this miner was different from them. As soon as he was caught by Scarlet, he couldn't help but scream in fear, "Let me go. You guys run too, those things are very powerful, they're invulnerable." He had seen his companions use their pickaxes to fight back against the monsters. Even if they used all their strength, they could only leave a shallow white mark on the monster's body. And when the monsters retaliated, their claws could easily crush half of a person's body. That nightmarish scene was still fresh in his mind. But before he could finish his sentence, the second half of his sentence was stuck in his throat. In his dark brown eyes, Brendel lightly swung his sword to the right, and the rock panther that was about to attack them was sliced into two like tofu. The two halves of the rock panther's body crashed heavily into the side of the cliff and shattered into pieces. The miner was dumbfounded. He pointed at Brando, looked at Scarlet, and then at the young man. He stuttered for a moment, unable to form a complete sentence. "Stop arguing." Scarlet impatiently slapped his hand away, but she also looked at Brando. When she saw Brando attack, she couldn't help but exclaim in her heart, "My lord's swordsmanship has improved again." Brendel's swordsmanship had indeed improved, and he only realized this after he dismembered the rock panther that was not even at the iron rank level. He opened the interface and found that the suffix behind his military swordsmanship had changed to +2. Although he didn't know how this +2 came about, it probably had something to do with Coden, the guard captain of the mine. He must have missed the system notification when he was buried by the rocks and passed out. Brando couldn't help but feel a little surprised and happy. Although it wasn't like the game didn't have examples of players receiving bonuses by experiencing the swordsmanship of high-tier NPC swordsmen, it wasn't much different from completing a swordsmanship quest. All the conditions had to be met. And the conditions were usually much harsher than the quest. Just like the last time when he comprehended his grandfather's swordsmanship in Brendel's dream. Firstly, it was because Sophie's soul had a high enough understanding of swordsmanship. Secondly, it was because Brendel and his grandfather were inextricably linked. Coupled with the fact that he had surpassed himself, it was natural for his swordsmanship to improve. But this time, it was a little strange. Of course, before Brando could finish thinking, another rock panther pounced on him. Brando instinctively swung his sword and sent it flying, but he was starting to get impatient with these annoying little things. He took a step back and directly charged into the encirclement. This time, the miner's expression not only froze, but he also fell to the ground. He didn't know there was such a powerful swordsman in the garrison. The illuminating crystal in Brendel's hand drew a bright arc in the dark underground tunnel. In the next moment, several rock panthers were cut in two. When the silver mine earthquake happened, Shaflun town was the first to receive the news. The edge of the earthquake affected the town, and the people standing on the street could feel the ground shaking. The shop owners on both sides of the street immediately pressed down on their plates to prevent them from falling to the ground and shattering. Of course, losses were unavoidable. For example, the owners of several pottery shops cursed. But the wider impact was that the news of the mine earthquake quickly spread throughout the town. Most of the women, children, and elderly living here had relatives who worked in the mines, so a sense of panic quickly spread. The rumor spread like wildfire in the town, and it didn't take long for the Roman girl to hear about it. In fact, the merchant girl stayed in her room and tried on the long dress that Brando gave her. It was something that Brando saw by chance in town, and it looked like a maid's outfit. He then remembered that he didn't give anything to the Roman, so he bought it with an ulterior motive. Of course, although his motive was a little dark, the Roman liked it very much. Of course, if it weren't for the fact that she was trying on clothes when the earthquake happened and bumped her head into the mirror frame, resulting in a red and swollen bump on her forehead, this incident would have looked even more perfect. The Roman was dizzy from the impact, but she was very curious. She immediately got up and rushed out of the door to ask the two angels what happened. The two angels naturally said that they didn't know anything. In the end, the merchant girl received accurate information from the innkeeper. There was an earthquake in the mine. Roman blinked his eyes. After carefully considering what the so-called earthquake was, he immediately became worried. She thought for a moment and made a serious decision. "I'm going to find Brando," she said to the two angels seriously. "Both of you will come with me." "Miss Roman, Master will not agree to such a thing," the first angel replied. "Master ordered us to stay in this inn until he returns. You are not allowed to run around." The second angel's words were obviously much more direct. "Besides, we are still fine. This means that Master is fine," the first angel advised. The Roman said in a methodical manner, "Brando is fine now. That's why we have to help him. Maybe he is trapped underground." If Brando knew that the Roman's words would come true, he would probably teach her a lesson. He would tell the merchant girl that since she knew that she had a crow's mouth, she shouldn't speak carelessly. Unfortunately, he didn't know. Therefore, the merchant girl was still very lively for the time being. However, the two angels didn't agree with her idea. They shook their heads and agreed that the merchant girl's idea would have a better future in a more meaningful field. For example, writing fairy tales. The Roman merchant girl knew that her request was rejected, but she wasn't discouraged. In fact, she didn't even know how to write the word discouraged. Not long after, the two angels who were doing their duty heard a loud shout coming from the room. Thinking that it was better to be safe than sorry, they rushed in at the first moment, only to see little Romaine wearing a long purple dress, her head covered in a blanket as she rolled around on the bed. In other words, she was acting like a spoiled child. When she felt the two angels rushing in, she lifted a corner of the blanket and peeked outside. She puffed up her cheeks and said, "I want to go to the mine." The unspoken message in his eyes was, "Otherwise, I'll make a scene for you all to see." The two angels looked at each other and shrugged. They closed the door and left without saying a word. After repeating this for 2 or 3 times, they gradually learned to turn a blind eye to the merchant girl's strange behavior. "His lordship told us not to make a fuss over nothing. It seems that it makes sense," the first angel said to his companion when he heard the merchant girl rolling around on the floor for the umpteenth time. "His lordship is always farsighted. I can see that he knows the Roman girl very well." The second angel nodded. "His lordship likes the Roman girl very much." The two angels finally reached a consensus. But what they didn't know was that the merchant girl, who was full of strange thoughts, was changing her clothes. When she noticed that Brando's two detestable subordinates were no longer surprised by her behavior and wouldn't enter the room no matter what they heard, she revealed a cunning smile. She methodically began to carry out her plan. She had changed into the usual traveler's clothing. She wore a pair of very fluffy pumpkin trousers and pointed leather boots, which made her look extremely comical. But when paired with the merchant lady's temperament of looking left and right, it complemented each other and made her look unusually cute. Then she put all her strange things into a small backpack, pulled up the bed sheet, opened the window, and jumped out. She even made a funny face at the door. But unfortunately, the merchant girl had thought of everything, but she neglected the most important point. She grabbed the bed sheet with one hand and carefully stepped on the tiles below with her little leather boots as she prepared to slide to the street behind the inn. Suddenly, she noticed a problem. The bed sheet wasn't long enough. Little Roman grabbed the bed sheet and swung back and forth in the air. His flat and smooth forehead was a little shiny. It seems like I've met with a little trouble, she thought. The old dwarf, Odin, was passing through the alleyway as usual to enjoy his afternoon ale at the Trout in the Forest. When he raised his head, he saw this strange scene. At first, he thought that he was still asleep, so he couldn't help but rub his eyes. Then, he finally confirmed that he wasn't mistaken. There was a girl wearing baggy pumpkin shorts holding a bedsheet and swinging it over her head not far away. The old dwarf lowered his head and thought about whether it was a carnival or something similar. However, he could not remember whether the last festival was the Midsummer Festival or the Harvest Festival. He sighed at how his memory deteriorated so quickly when he got old. Then, he remembered that the last festival had been a few weeks ago, and the next one was still a month or two away. He thought that he must have entered the wrong place. Or maybe there was something wrong with the way he entered the alleyway. However, he immediately realized that it was the window at the back of the Trout in the Forest Inn. Wasn't it? Thinking until here, the old dwarf finally woke up from his dazed state. He raised his head and stared at the young girl who was swaying in midair. He used his hand to support his chin and asked, "Little girl, what are you doing?" "I'm sorry, old man. The bed sheet is too short." That was the Roman's first answer. "On the 19th, my relative is getting married. I'm not sure if I'll be updating, but I'll make up for it if it's missing." To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 296. It took Odin quite a bit of effort to catch the little girl who was dangling in the air. Odin's face was stern and his thick eyebrows were almost knitted together. He kept grumbling that she was too daring and didn't care about the danger at all, and that she had caused a lot of trouble for an old man like him. But in the end, Odin still asked, "Little one, are you hurt anywhere?" "Ah." Descending from midair, little Roman patted his chest the moment his feet touched the ground. He exhaled deeply and said happily, "That's right. That was really dangerous." However, there was no trace of danger on her face. Instead, her little face was flushed red, and she had an excited expression on her face. Odin glanced at her and thought to himself, "So you know that it was dangerous." However, his next words were stuck in his throat as he heard Romain say excitedly, "How interesting." Odin's expression turned serious when he heard that and lectured her, "Little girl, it's not good to think that way. It's too dangerous. If I didn't come over, wouldn't you have been injured?" "Old man, you came over." The Roman replied as if it was a matter of fact. Odin scratched his head and thought that there was something wrong with that statement. So he continued to persuade her, "That's just in case. There's also what if, isn't there? Besides, little girl, what you're doing is causing a lot of trouble for an old man like me. Let's not talk about how you're delaying this old man's drinking time. My aunt says it's not good for your health to drink too much." The merchant girl took the opportunity to interject. The old dwarf suddenly felt a headache coming on. Why was this little girl's way of thinking so different from ordinary people? He began to wonder if it was a wise decision to save this little girl. Perhaps he should have pretended that he did not see anything and went back to drinking his wine. No, perhaps he should not have even raised his head. Odin was a little annoyed and quickly waved his hand. "That's not what we're talking about. Besides, a dwarf who doesn't drink can't be called a dwarf. Little guy, your aunt." The old dwarf thought for a moment and felt that it was not honorable to speak ill of someone behind their back, not to mention that the other party was a woman. So he changed his tune and said, "Anyway, one thing is another. You see, a normal person wouldn't swing around in the alley behind the inn while holding the bed sheets, right?" The old dwarf instructed. However, he subconsciously felt that there was something wrong with his words. But after thinking about it carefully, he couldn't find where the problem was. He could only shake his head and throw this strange thought away. But in his heart, he secretly thought that the good time of drinking in the afternoon seemed to be getting further and further away from him. Because the little girl had started chattering again. However, Odom did not realize that he had been diverted to her way of thinking, and it was up to her to use her rich experience to defeat the old dwarf. Roman thought for a while and nodded. "You're right." But she frowned her pretty little eyebrows. "But Roman has no choice. I'm also in a hurry to go to the mines." The old dwarf was stunned. "Why are you going to the mines?" he asked. "Women aren't allowed to enter the mines." "Because the person Roman likes is in the mines. There's an earthquake in the mines, and the Roman is very anxious." She looked at the dwarf and suddenly blinked. "Oh right. Old man, can you bring Roman to the mines? You don't know the way." Odom's little eyes were wide open. "I think so." She didn't seem to realize that this was a serious problem. It was obvious that she had once again committed the mistake of acting first and thinking later. Before she was ready to do this, she had already forgotten all the embarrassing things that had happened to her when she was young. There's a saying that a person can't make the same mistake twice in a lifetime, but our merchant lady clearly had the ability to make two identical mistakes in a variety of ways. But this time, Odom laughed. Of course, it was more accurate to say that the old dwarf was laughing out loud. He laughed heartily, laughing so hard that he almost fell down. As he laughed, he mumbled, "How interesting, how interesting. This is the first time I've heard of such a reckless plan. Even the most reckless mountain dwarves can't do this, little girl. Even the clumsy beast men have to plan thoroughly before they hunt." The Roman agreed, because the beast men have a saying, "Uimaus nemont." She stuttered as she read out the saying. "It means that a smart hunter might not be smart. That's just a beast's cunning." The old dwarf immediately shook his head. "No, who taught you that?" "It was my aunt." "No, no." Odom felt that he had been tricked. "What I mean is, these two things don't match at all. We're saying that a person shouldn't be too rash, and it has nothing to do with beast men being smart." He stroked his beard and suddenly frowned. "Wait, what did you just say?" "There's an earthquake in the mines." "Yes. Why didn't I know about it?" The Roman looked at him with her big eyes. The old dwarf immediately realized that he had asked a silly question. But if the earthquake happened an hour ago, he should have been taking a nap then. In fact, Odom should have been in the mines, but he had missed the time to enter the mines because he was drunk. It was not the first time, but the old dwarf had helped the clerk of the mines solve some personal problems and won the young noble's trust. As for whether he had to work in the mines or not, the young noble did not care. There was no problem with having one more person or one less person in the mines. That was why Odom was too lazy to go to the mines and came to the Trout in the Forest for a drink. That was his goal as a dwarf. However, the little girl's words had piqued his interest. The old dwarf had always known that there was a secret hidden in the mines, and he had come here to wait for an opportunity after he found out about it. But what disappointed him was that ever since the workers of Shaflun mine dug through the tunnels that led to the Great Beehive and caused an accident, the tunnels no longer extended downwards, and the secret hidden in the Greyhar Mountains could only stay there quietly. Although the old dwarf had asked Perkins more than once if he could reopen the 5th level of mining, it was always put on hold due to safety concerns. The young clerk wasn't worried about the safety of the workers, but rather, he didn't want to cause any trouble for himself. But as time passed, Odom gradually became disheartened after coming to Shaflund for a few years. But at this time, his heart was moved again. The old dwarf muttered in his heart and looked at the little girl. All right, I'll bring you to the mines, but let me say this first, I understand. Little Roman replied in an extremely straightforward manner, without the slightest bit of sloppiness. But I'm not done yet. Yes. But I'll give the same answer no matter what you say, old man. So it doesn't matter if it's earlier or later. You're a frank one. The old dwarf sighed, but you're quite likable. Looking at the little Roman girl, Odin could not help but think of the lively little girls back in his hometown. He grew up among the golden dwarves when he was young, and although his hometown was not as novel and varied as the humans, and they did not have excellent winemaking techniques, the dwarven girls were much more lively than the human girls. But this little girl made his eyes light up. Although he had a headache, she was to his liking. Of course, she was to his liking, but the old dwarf knew that if he let her do as she pleased, she would cause a lot of trouble for him. So he said as he walked, in any case, the 3 rules are very important. Do you understand, little girl? The little Roman nodded respectfully, but she immediately had a new question. But didn't you say that women can't enter the mines? Don't interrupt, little girl. Odin frowned. He obviously could not bring the Roman into the mines openly. In fact, even he could not enter the mines himself. But it did not matter. He had prepared for a long time for this plan, and some of the arrangements he had made beforehand could be put to good use. He had dug a secret tunnel outside the mines that led to the mines. Since he was the supervisor of the mines, no one would suspect anything if they bumped into him. As for the little girl, it was a little troublesome, but it was just a matter of putting on makeup. Yes, Romain followed up and asked, but old man, are the mountain dwarves all so rash? Old man, are you a mountain dwarf as well? Of course I'm not a mountain dwarf. Those rash fellows have nothing to do with me. I'm... The short and fat dwarf suddenly stopped and coughed heavily. Don't interrupt. Oh. The battle underground had come to an end. When the last rock beast was reduced to pieces, Brando found a few corpses of miners at the end of the tunnel. After the man identified them, he realized that they were the corpses of his former companions. After the miner who was saved by Brando saw the young man's strength, he was determined to follow them. Even when Brando advised him to hide in the safer 3rd level of the mine, the latter shook his head and refused. He felt that it was much safer to follow the 2 of them. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com to read more chapters, support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 297. In fact, there was almost no loot from the previous battle. The EXP he gained was just some experience points. In fact, Brando found that he didn't gain much from killing monsters below the level of Black Iron, to be exact, monsters below level 15. This was exactly the same as his experience in the game. But he found a ring in the wreckage, an ogre ring. In the amber sword, equipment with the prefix ogre could increase the wearer's strength. In fact, this was a series of equipment, with a wide range of levels ranging from level 20 to 70. The lower ones were titled ghouls, while the higher ones were mostly prefixed with dragons. This ogre ring was the lowest of the bunch, at level 20, but it was far beyond Brando's imagination. In the game, there was less than a 1 in 1,000 chance that a level 15 monster would drop a level 20 magic item. Of course, the highest level on the list was a level 25 armor, which only had a 1 in 10,000 chance, or in the player's words, it was basically 0. But with Brendel's usual unlucky hand, he could not help but look at Scarlet a few more times when he received the ring. Could she also be the holder of the legendary Lucky Hand halo? Brando checked the attributes. The ogre ring increased the wearer's strength by 5%. Brando's strength was 73. 4 ounces, and because of the implanted Ghost Knight's crystal and power burst, his strength was close to 100 ounces. This thing could increase his strength by about 5 ounces, which was better than nothing. But he already had the Ring of the Wind Empress, the Ring of Flame, the Ring of Secondary Snake, and the Ring of Warrior on his hand. Brando thought for a moment and was too lazy to change, so he simply threw the ring to the red-haired girl behind him. Scarlet took the ring and was slightly stunned. I don't have any strength again," she whispered, a little puzzled. "That's only temporary," Brando replied. "It won't be long before you recover." "Really?" Her amber eyes suddenly lit up. Brando looked back at the girl, slightly silent, but finally nodded. "When have I ever lied to anyone? Of course it's true." Scarlet's face revealed an extremely happy expression. However, this red-haired young lady had a sharp sense that was unique to females. She sensed Brando's hesitation. She thought for a moment, blinked her eyes, and said, "Is it related to the blood of God, sir?" Brando nodded. "Actually, it's nothing." Scarlet wasn't worried at all. She smiled. "Compared to becoming a monster, I'm more worried about losing my power. At least then, I can still fight for my lord." "Shoo!" Brando put a finger to his lips and gestured to the back. The miner still followed them at a distance, and, of course, did not hear what was said between them. Scarlet nodded and put the ring on her index finger. She was so careful, as if she was protecting a treasure. "Actually, you don't have to be so careful. This thing isn't worth much. It's just a magic item." Brando couldn't help but remind him. But Scarlet smiled and replied, "Yes, but as a gift, the meaning is very different." Brando was stunned. The young lady had already changed the topic. She looked at the surrounding rock walls and asked in a low voice, "Sir, do you think the earthquake has anything to do with these monsters?" Brando nodded. "Did the earthquake cause these monsters to appear from underground?" Scarlet asked again. "I'm afraid it's the opposite." "The opposite?" The mercenary was slightly stunned. How can such weak monsters cause an earthquake? Weak? Brando shook his head. That was only temporary. If this quest really involved a silver legacy, then it was hard to say what they would encounter later on. With this thought in mind, they gradually went deeper into the fourth layer of the mine. Soon, Brando found Mahan's corpse at a corner. Not far from the left side of the supervisor were 2 incomplete rock leopards. There were obvious sword wounds on their bodies that killed them. It was obvious that Mahan had fought with these beasts when he was alive, but he could not escape death in the end. Brando checked the man's wounds. The fatal wound was on his neck. According to his judgment, Mahan should be at least at the level of a black iron, but the wound left behind by the attacker was very clean. It was obviously a one-hit kill. For this to work, the attacker's strength must be far greater than the victim's. This meant that there were more powerful monsters here. Brando was not the only one who saw this. Scarlet also saw this. She did not say a word, but her face became solemn. When the miner saw the supervisor's corpse, he trembled and fell to the ground. He was scared out of his wits. In his mind, these foremen were usually high and mighty existences. But when they turned into cold corpses, it made him feel like he could die at any time. He almost lost control of his emotions and could not help but scream. Brando had no choice but to use the secondary snake ring to paralyze him so that he would not attract more monsters. It was not easy to wait for the miner to calm down before they could continue moving forward. Brando observed the surroundings and decisively chose a tunnel to the north. If he remembered correctly, this should be the place where he separated from Cohen and the others. But this time, the 3 of them did not move for long before 2 groups of rock leopards surrounded them from all directions. These rock beasts quietly came from the shadows, and there seemed to be more and more of them. Brando used 2 of his swords, but he gradually began to realize that these rock leopards seemed to be endless. Scarlet seemed to have noticed this at the same time. She whispered from behind, "My lord, we have to find a way to leave this place." Brando nodded, but his plan was slightly different from the mercenary girls. He knew that if it was a normal person here, they could only sit and wait for death. And if it was a mercenary with some ability, they would probably make the same choice as Scarlet. But he was different. He was a player. Continuously killing monsters like this was an extremely abnormal phenomenon in the game. He immediately calmed down and based on his experience, he looked for the leader hidden among the low-level monsters. Sure enough, he soon saw a cat with a smooth surface like black jade flash through the darkness. Although it was only a glimpse, Brando could already tell that it was at least a mid-level iron rank. It was not black jade, but obsidian. This was the guy he was looking for. The young man immediately slashed the small fries blocking the way and took the lead to chase after it. But what surprised Brando was that when he showed hostility, the thing's reaction was shockingly fast. Before he could swing his sword, the black leopard had already turned around and disappeared into the darkness. The obsidian rock leopard's speed was extremely fast, even far exceeding its strength. Brando's charge skill had not even begun to charge, but the creature had already disappeared without a trace after turning a corner. It was not just the beast. Brando immediately noticed that the low-level rock leopards around him retreated like the tide. He stopped in shock, but the monsters around him suddenly disappeared without a trace. What's going on? Brando did not think that it was because of his overbearing aura that scared the monsters away. Elemental creatures did not have emotions at all. They only had the basic ability to make logical judgments. The mine tunnel became empty. What was that? Scarlet and the miners saw the monster that disappeared in a flash. When Brando stopped, they immediately chased after him and asked, "Leader?" Brando replied, "Leader refers to the leader of a group of monsters, but here it is the summoner's eyes." The same goes for elven messengers, beast summoners, and even necromancers. No matter how powerful a spellcaster is, they can't control an entire army by themselves. They need lower-level spies to control those summoned creatures that only have the lowest intelligence. For example, low-level necromancers and skeletons. It's the same here. He pointed to the depths of the mine tunnel and said, "But I don't know how big this summoning network is. If the black jade-like leopard is the highest level of this network, then it's easy to deal with. What if it's not? Then it's troublesome," Brando said as he walked deeper into the tunnel. But Scarlet seemed to be a little worried. She felt that everything underground was strange. Although this lord seemed to know what was going on, she did not like the feeling of being shrouded in the unknown. She thought for a moment and could not help but say, "My lord, let's go back to the third level first. Isn't our goal to find the guard captain and take control of the silver mine? Why do we have to make things difficult for these monsters here?" Brando shook his head. "It was like that at first, but Scarlet, it's different now." "Different again?" Scarlet was stunned. Brando nodded. The value of a silver legacy was much higher than the entire silver mine. It was like using a gold mine to exchange with Brando's golden apple. Brando would never do such a stupid thing. But he did not explain much and walked deeper into the tunnel. But before he took 2 steps, he made a soft sound of surprise. "What's wrong?" Scarlet asked from behind. "Come and take a look at this," Brendel said as he turned the corner. The red-haired girl limped forward with the help of the lightning spear, but as soon as she turned the corner, she was stunned. Behind the corner was a vast space, but at this moment, it was as if a terrible storm had happened here. To be more precise, under the dim light of the illuminating crystal, there were pieces of the rock leopard in the mine. There were even some black jade-like pieces scattered among the gray rocks. Needless to say, these were the remains of another kind of monster. Brando raised his head and looked into the depths of the cave. "It seems that someone got here before us. A powerful guy. he said. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation to be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. Chapter 298. The underground world was shrouded in boundless darkness, and the long tunnel was silent. The only sound that could be heard was the sound of the underground water seeping into the rock layer above and dripping to the ground. This kind of voice only rang out once in a long time in the depths of the abyss where one couldn't even see one's own fingers. Medisha had to stop and rest after driving away a large number of uninvited guests from the underground. Even though she was a ghost, it did not mean that she did not know fatigue. The activity of the soulfire restricted the movement of undead creatures to a certain extent. However, she didn't need any light. In the darkness, a faint fluorescent light was hidden in her pupils, allowing her to see very far in the dark. The silver fairy princess did not sit down, but leaned against the wall to rest with her spear in one hand. Her body was surrounded by the fragments of the rock leopard, and these incomplete corpses were scattered far away. Unlike Brando, she was attacked almost as soon as she entered this level. She had killed a bloody path to reach this place. After a moment of silence, the silver fairy princess asked the other side of the darkness, "Is there an elevator here?" Medisha was not alone in the darkness. The only sound came from the other side of the tunnel. "Yes." That voice replied. But Medisha was not at ease. Just as she finished speaking, she put her hand on her spear and looked in the direction she came from. But just as she turned her head, her face lit up with joy and she shouted, "My lord!" It was Brando and Scarlet who came. They raised the illuminating crystals in their hands and shone the light in their direction. When they saw Medisha, they were not too surprised. They had followed the traces left by the Silver Elf Princess all the way here. Brando was not too surprised when he discovered that the so-called powerful person might be Medisha. There were only a few of them in the underground, and if it was not the Silver Elf Princess, Coden, and even Yuta did not have the strength to do so. But when they saw the other person in the illuminated area, they were stunned. "Medisha?" Brando asked, "This is?" He looked at Coden, who was sitting on the ground without saying a word. He was a little confused. The previously majestic old man was now in a sorry state. His forehead, face, and blue-gray uniform were covered in blood, and his gray hair was a mess. "Mr. Coden is injured," Medisha replied. This elven princess was smart enough to stop there, but there were still many things that she did not say out loud. But she knew that Brando would understand what she meant. The old man snorted, "I am a captive, what is there to hide?" But this little girl saw that my old bones still have some use, so she signed a non-aggression agreement. "But she's very respectful to you, boy. She said that the final decision is in your hands, my lord. Tell me, do you want me to kill you or cut you up?" Although he said that, he couldn't help but curse the fairy princess for being so cunning. When the tunnel collapsed, everyone's first reaction was to protect themselves. It was as if it was an instinct to save their own lives. Even gold-ranked existences like them were no exception. But Coden didn't expect that not everyone present was a living being. When the landslide happened, Medisha's first reaction was not to retreat to a safe place, but to attack him while the rocks were falling. This was a suicidal attack. Even someone as calm as Coden couldn't help but jump in fright. However, a battle between gold-ranked existences could be decided in the blink of an eye. Although Coden was much stronger than Medisha, he had used all his strength to chase after Brando, and he wasn't prepared for the landslide. In the end, he was heavily injured by Medisha. In the end, if it wasn't for this little girl pulling him out of the rubble, he would have died in the mine. But even so, he couldn't help but admire Medisha's courage. If it was him in that situation, he wouldn't have made the same choice. No matter what the reason was, Coden, as a veteran soldier, had nothing to say about being defeated on the battlefield. But if he knew that Medisha was just a spirit, he would probably regret underestimating her. Hearing his words, the young man nodded and asked, "Promise?" Mr. Coden promised to lead me to you and return to the surface. He is very familiar with the terrain here. He knows where the tunnels are, where it connects to the next level, and where it can be opened without causing a large-scale collapse. Medisha explained in detail. Although she was speaking in Cruz, it was as if she could naturally sing an elvish aria. "My lord, there is an elevator not far from here. It leads to the main tunnel on the 3rd level. There are many tunnels leading to the surface, so it shouldn't be blocked." She smiled. "If it wasn't for Mr. Coden, I wouldn't have been able to find this place so quickly." Brando knew that she was talking about the elevator that Cohen and the others came down from. He remembered that the tunnel was very large, with 3 wooden tracks. He nodded and looked at Coden. "What is his condition?" "Let Mr. Coden tell us." Coden glanced at Brando. "Boy, I know what you're planning to do. Originally, as a prisoner, I had nothing much to say. Now, you can naturally take over this place as you wish. It will take at least a month, and at most 3 months. Lord Paulus won't notice any clues." He paused for a moment. "My condition is simple. I don't want to end up like Groton." "He knows." Brendel's heart skipped a beat. The riot in Abes could not be kept a secret, but not everyone knew about Groton's death. It was common knowledge that a riot in Erewhon's territory was not a big deal, but other than a few unlucky ones, no one had ever heard of a lord with real power being killed in a riot. Therefore, after the riot in Abes, most people guessed that Groton had escaped through a secret tunnel. Only a few of the higher-ups in Brendel's organization knew that Groton could not be more dead. Brendel looked at Coden deeply. If the outside world knew about Groton's death, then the situation would be completely different. Lord Paulus might not be able to wait and send out his troops, and Count Randner might not give Tonagel enough time to deal with the problem himself. If the old fox sensed that his territory was in danger of being separated, he would send out his army in less than 2 weeks. Brando hoped that the news would not be balanced to buy time. If Count Randner did not know whether Groton was dead or not, then he would be inclined to let his useless son deal with the problems in his territory. At that time, they were just a bunch of rioters in the eyes of the nobles. Rioters were nothing to be afraid of, and Groton had many retainers under him. But with Groton's death, this small rebellion was treated as a rebellion. Even though he knew that he was starting a rebellion, even if it wasn't to divide Aween, his actions were seen as a serious challenge to the rules of the game in the eyes of the nobles. According to Brendel's plan, Count Randner would only realize this after Lord Maxon and Lord Paulus were defeated. Brendel still had 1 or 2 months before that. Coden seemed to have seen through his thoughts. The old man smiled mysteriously. "You don't have to worry, it's just a rumor. But when I see you all here, I'm 80% sure that the people in Ferber aren't rioters." Coden shook his head. "But I don't know if it's you or me who's crazy. Ever since the year of the Zither, Erewhon hasn't had a rebellion for almost 100 years. Brando nodded. The year of the Zither was the era of Hesse I, who was nicknamed the King of the Roads. He was the most notorious king in Erewhon's history, and one of the last rulers of the Cipher dynasty. This nickname came from the fact that he organized an army to rob all the merchants who passed through Erewhon, regardless of whether they were local or foreign. He openly declared that all property in Erewhon's territory belonged to him, and all merchants who traveled on the roads had to pay him 2/3 of the value of their goods. This act of his angered everyone except for him. In the end, Hesse I was ousted from the throne after only 3 years. He was the only king in Erewhon's history to die in the hands of the angry people. Of course, from His Majesty's performance, it could be seen that the people of Aween were in dire straits at that time. That was the darkest era in Erewhon's history. If not for the rise of Madara, the current Erewhon would not have been as chaotic as it was then. That was also the era in Erewhon's history when uprisings, riots, and rebellions were the most frequent. In Won's world, it was rare to see the word uprising in the history books. But perhaps this was the so-called power and fortune of the nation. Madara had to borrow Owen's strength to rise, so the Corvado dynasty was able to rise under the same circumstances. But under better conditions, Princess Griffin's reforms failed. But Brando did not have time to sigh. He shook his head and said, "This condition is too vague. We can coexist peacefully here, but once we leave the underground and reach the surface, how can we guarantee that you won't run away and spread the news?" It was not unreasonable for him to think this way. If it was the subterranean dwellers, he could ask Tajiv to swear to their gods. But humans were probably the least religious people in the world. Although they often talked about Lady Martha, even if they swore to Martha, most of them would not take it seriously. Brendel was a human himself, so he knew this better than anyone else. But Coden shrugged and said, "This old man is seriously injured. I can't run away even if I want to. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Chapter 299. Brando smiled. You might not be able to escape now, but that might not be the case in the future. Once you recover your strength, no one will be able to stop you. There were some things that he did not say. Brando could not possibly leave two gold-ranked warriors in the mines just to watch over one person. Coden placed a hand on his sword, but he quickly let go. The old man could sense that the young man was interested in his suggestion, or else he would not have said so much to him. If that's the case, what do you think we should do? Brando pondered for a moment and asked, "What's the name of the clerk in the mines?" Coden was stunned. He could not keep up with Brendel's thoughts. He didn't understand why the topic was brought up to the noble clerk, but he still replied, "Perkins. Perkins from the Sackerville family. You know him." Coden narrowed his eyes. He instinctively sniffed out Brendel's identity. It was likely that he was a young noble. After all, a normal person would not have such a clear understanding of the nobles. It was just like how a well-informed person in the capital might know the names of the nobles above him, but outside of Corvado, he might not know the nobles in the other provinces. However, Perkins was the nephew of Count Ranner's wife, and belonged to the same class as Grodin in the Ranner province. It was impossible for Brando not to have heard of him. Even though Perkins was not famous in this era, the players would have to deal with the young nobles as the old nobles gradually aged and passed away. Brando remembered that Perkins was the lord of the Silman region, but he did not expect him to be the clerk of the Schaflund mines. He immediately realized that the silver mines were Count Ranner's confidant, and it was possible that Perkins had gained the Count's trust from there. He cursed in his heart. This kid's bright future is going to be ruined because of my actions. But, in the spirit of not letting his friends die, he had no choice but to say sorry in his heart. "I heard that he's a decent guy?" Brendel asked in a roundabout manner. "That's a nice comment." Coden raised his eyebrows. "It would be better to say that he's as timid as a mouse and mediocre." He didn't hold back at all as he mocked. Perkins had destroyed a squad of his subordinates, and this old man was still brooding over it. You nobles just love to say nice things. After saying that, he looked at Brando provocatively. Brando didn't care about Coden's probing. He was just pondering in his heart. According to Coden's evaluation of Perkins and his understanding of Perkins, that young clerk would do everything he could to suppress the chaos in the mines for the sake of his own future. He definitely wouldn't send someone to inform Lord Paulus. This way, they would have plenty of time to search for the path to the surface. Whether or not the elderly sword master would lead the way wouldn't affect his plan at all. But when he looked at Coden, he had another idea. He didn't want a gold-ranked expert to return to Count Randner's hands, but it was a problem to keep him here. Coden didn't seem to be completely loyal to Count Randner, or else he wouldn't be here to negotiate with them. However, he still had the demeanor of a knight. It wouldn't be easy for him to surrender, especially when he didn't have the strength to do so. Brando thought for a moment and had a plan in mind. Then I'll have to trouble you to come back to Escapades with us for the time being. After this period of time, I will naturally let you go. It will take at least a month and at most half a year. He didn't mind sending 1 or 2 gold-ranked experts to watch over the swordmaster in Escapades. Half a year. Coden narrowed his eyes. If I don't appear in the mines for a long time, it will arouse suspicion. Aren't you worried that the news will be leaked? Brando thought that this old man was really cunning, but he had already considered this point. It's fine. Didn't you suffer heavy injuries in the earthquake? You'll need some time to recuperate, and I think Hawkins will understand. He purposely emphasized the words Hawkins will understand. Coden snorted in disdain. He knew why the clerk would understand. If he didn't, the young man would use his sword to make him understand. The clerk wasn't a tough nut to crack. He could imagine that if Brando threatened him, the clerk would cry and become their mouthpiece. The old man fell silent. It seems like you've made up your mind. But how can I guarantee that I can leave after a month or half a year? He asked again. Why should I guarantee that? Brando retorted. Coden was stunned. He raised his silver-gray eyebrows and glared at Brendel. But since I asked you to go to Escapades, as long as you don't act rashly, I won't do anything unnecessary. Brando replied. I won't make unnecessary sacrifices. You're a veteran of the November War, aren't you? Life is precious, and the winner of a war is the one who survives. The old man snorted. You know very well that there are survivors of that war among your elders. Brando did not answer and only stared at the old man. The old man glanced at the ring on Brando's finger and remained silent for a while. He then asked, judging from your actions, you're planning to stay here for a long time. But I have to remind you that Count Randner will not allow a territory to be separated from his control, even if it's the most barren Tonajol. Are you prepared to face the wrath of a king? Other than Corvado, Erwin was controlled by 13 vassals. These vassals included 6 dukes, 2 marquises, and 5 counts with special privileges. Their power was comparable to the royal family, and they were nicknamed the kings under the throne by the people. Among these kings, other than Duke Arek, Duke Vero, and Duke Cypher who were the strongest, the rest of them were on par with each other. Count Randner was not the strongest among them, but he was not the weakest either. In Coden's opinion, Brando and the others were like ants trying to challenge a giant. They could be crushed at any time. However, Brando laughed and shook his head. You've got 2 things wrong. First, I knew what Count Randner would do from the start. Second, Tonajol is not the most barren of lands. Coden looked at him deeply. Confidence is a good thing, but arrogance is not necessarily the same, young man. I agree. Brando replied. Fine, I don't care what you think. The old man shook his head and stopped talking about it. He placed his hand on his sword once more. I still want a promise. Promise me that you will let me leave after at least half a year. You promise that you won't return to Count Randner's side. I'm sorry, but I can't promise that. Coden replied firmly. Brando looked at him with admiration, but he did not refuse this time. He smiled. Fine, I promise. I don't need half a year, just 3 months. The old man was slightly taken aback. He raised his head and looked at Brendel in surprise. Brando smiled and did not explain. After reaching an agreement, Metasha was also done resting. She felt the soul fire in her body becoming active again, and they continued on their journey. At this time, Brando glanced at the miner behind them. In fact, when he found out that Brando and Scarlet were not part of the mine's garrison, but were traitors who wanted to go against Count Randner, the poor man was terrified and almost wanted to run away. But he quickly calmed down. Compared to thinking about the future, the monsters that were lurking in the mines would immediately take his life. In the end, the man still followed them. But he met Scarlet, and after the red-haired girl threatened him fiercely, the miner had no choice but to bring his family to Abes with him. During the conversation, Brando found out that the man had also learned some skills as a silversmith, so he decided to give him a job as an apprentice blacksmith. In comparison, this job was much safer than being a miner, and the benefits were much greater. In the end, the man still felt uneasy, but he could not help but look forward to it. With these thoughts in mind, he felt the people in front of him stop again. But this time, they did not encounter any monsters or people. Instead, there was no way out. To be exact, everyone saw a dark door not far from them in the mine tunnel. The door was tightly shut and sealed off the entire tunnel. Medisha and Scarlet could not help but stop and look at Coden. He said that this path could lead to the elevator. But when they saw the old swordsman's face, they could not believe what they saw. This is... Coden was slightly taken aback. Shouldn't I be asking you that? Scarlet frowned. Her voice was weak, but it was filled with suspicion. No, what's going on? Coden frowned and said to Medisha, Miss, can you help me over there to take a look? Medisha looked at Brando with a questioning gaze, and the young man nodded. He had been here before and knew that the old man was not lying. There should not be such a door in this place. He had a suspicion, but he still needed to confirm it. The Silver Elf Princess did as she was told, supporting the elderly Master Swordsman as they walked over. The Master Swordsman used his hand to feel the cold, heavy giant door as he muttered to himself, How is this possible? How is this possible? Chapter 300. My lord. Scarlet looked at Coden, who was muttering to himself, and asked in a low voice. Brando shook his head and signaled for her to calm down. The door must have appeared out of nowhere, and it might have something to do with the monsters. Sure enough, Coden suddenly stopped and whispered, There are words on the door. Everyone leaned over, and sure enough, they saw some strange patterns engraved on the black iron door. To be more precise, they were words. Brando saw the trapezoidal characters and immediately said, It's the language of the dwarves. It's the dwarven language. Dwarven language. Coden frowned and turned his head. Why is there dwarven language here? Tonajal only has the hill dwarves, and they don't live underground. What about the grey dwarves and the iron dwarves? Medisha asked. The grey dwarves and the iron dwarves were both creatures that lived underground. The grey dwarves were close relatives of the alpine dwarves, while the iron dwarves were said to be descendants of the rune dwarves. But Brando shook his head. The grey dwarves and the iron dwarves both used the cuneiform script of Jorgandi Ridge, and not the trapezoidal script of the dwarven language. In fact, the trapezoidal script was the official language of the dwarves. The cuneiform script was invented by the Dark Elves. Then who could it be? The Silver Elf Princess asked. Brando thought about the silver inheritance and suspected that it might be a branch of the silver dwarves that had disappeared. There were 3 silver dwarves, the storm dwarves, the rune dwarves, and the fire dwarves. Apart from the fire dwarves, who lived in the fire elemental world, this inheritance could be one of the first 2. But before he could speak, Scarlet pointed her lightning spear at the door, and a soft ding sounded from the darkness. The girl looked at the door and saw that it was as smooth as a mirror. There was not a single mark on it, which proved that the door was sturdy beyond imagination. She frowned and asked, My lord, what is written on it? I don't know, Brando shook his head. Boy, didn't you say it was the dwarven language? Coden raised his eyebrows in annoyance. How can you not know? I only know what the dwarven language looks like, Brando thought to himself. He was not in the amber space where the system could automatically translate. Here, he could only stare helplessly at these things. However, he walked over and placed his hand on the door. However, I suspect that this is a barrier. Barrier? Was it a spell? Is it an illusion? The old man raised his silver-gray eyebrows. There are other people underground. He looked at Brando suspiciously. You're not the only one here. Brando shook his head. This enchantment is not a spell. Wizard's magic is just using the laws of the world. However, in ancient times, enchantments were set up by the gods. These barriers themselves represent a kind of law. Coden did not understand, but Medicia's eyes widened. Ancient heritage. My lord, are you saying that there's a sacred place behind this? It's not a holy land. I'm afraid it's a sanctum. Brando sized up the door. The entrance to a holy land could not be so small. It was like a valley in the land of the fairies, and it was large enough to accommodate 2 huge statues. However, if this was a sanctum used to store the silver legacy, then it made sense. The young man placed his hand on the cold iron door and closed his eyes, as if he could feel the thousands of years of history behind the door. At the same time, he asked, Medusa, what is the ancient heritage of the Silver Elves? The elven princess paused for a moment, then shook her head. I don't know. I've never been to the sanctum. When the War of the Holy Saints began, the Silver Elves had already left the sanctum for 10 generations. It was said that we could no longer find our way back. Brando shook his head. I'm afraid that's not the case. The Silver Elves should have returned to the sanctum by now. What is the name of your sanctum? Sanctum Silver Valley. Brendel nodded, but Scarlet asked in confusion, My lord, this isn't the time to talk about this, is it? Shouldn't we find a way to open this door first? I'm trying, Brando replied. Ha! For an ancient barrier, the door is a symbol of an entrance, Brando replied. The meaning of an entrance is to enter. If you just want to go to the other side of the tunnel, you won't be able to open this door no matter what. Enter. Enter where? The red-haired girl was puzzled. You'll know soon enough. Brando closed his eyes and thought enter in his heart. Then suddenly, everyone felt their vision go dark. But before the sound of panic could be heard, the light became bright again. To be exact, it became brighter. It was as if they had suddenly returned to the surface. Bright and dazzling light shone from the outside. Every pair of eyes that had adapted to the darkness could not help but squint slightly. The surroundings were snowy white, and their eyes hurt slightly. Scarlet and the miner subconsciously turned their heads. Only the stronger Coden and Medusa could stare at their surroundings. But the 2 of them immediately let out a low cry. The voices around them suddenly became louder. It was a tsunami of cheers that poured into everyone's ears like a tidal wave. And as everyone gradually adapted to the dazzling light and the deafening cheers around them, they looked up and finally saw everything around them. They remembered that they were still in the dark underground tunnel just a moment ago, blocked by a thick iron door. But now, they found themselves in a brightly lit square. Or worse. After looking a little further, everyone found that it was not a square at all, but a gladiator arena. They stood in the middle of the empty space, but there were towering walls and spectator seats in all directions. The spectator seats were full. Brando could not see the faces of the spectators against the bright light, but he knew that it was just a projection of a spell. A gap space. That was the content of this barrier. In terms of complexity, this dimension was far less mysterious than Fairyland, which existed in the crevice between space and time. It was merely a demi-plane connected to the world of Vaughn's main material plane, a small subspace. But in terms of the sound and light effects, it was enough to make people dizzy. He could not help but think that it was that guy who designed all of this. "What is this place, my lord?" Scarlet finally calmed herself down, and could not help but ask in a trembling voice. She was still all right, but the miner was already paralyzed with fear. Medisha and the old man did not say a word, but the former was obviously calmer, while the latter was vigilant, with his hand on his sword. "The Arena of Destiny," Brando replied. "The Arena of Destiny? What is that?" Brando looked up. "Do you see that sword?" Following this question, everyone followed his gaze, and saw that in the middle of the arena, there was a stone tablet with a long sword stabbed into it. The black long sword reflected a layer of faint light under the dazzling light, but the shape of the sword was quite strange. It looked like a long sword, but it was as wide as a palm, and the blade was much longer than an ordinary long sword. It was better to say that it was a combination of a two-handed greatsword and a long sword. "What is that?" Coden looked at the sword, his eyebrows twitching. As an experienced swordsman, of course he could see that it was an excellent sword. "The Halran Gaia," Medisha replied. "I recognize this sword. It is the silver legacy of the Rune Dwarves." "Yes, this is the Halran Gaia. Legend has it that it is connected to the earth, and when it is swung, it will cause the earth to shake and mountains to collapse." Brendel knew the sword's other name. The players called it the Sword of Earthquake, because Halran Gaia's attack was accompanied by an earthquake spell that was equal to the damage of the sword itself. Earthquake was an area of effect spell, and its range was almost the same as the direction and range of the sword wind. Although it consumed mana, it was definitely worth it. This sword was a divine weapon for spellswordsmen. Even Brando could not help but move his fingers when he saw it. For a swordsman, this sword was too attractive. Not to mention, this sword also had a leadership attribute. The lead attribute usually appeared on equipment with obvious faction and attribute characteristics. For example, Halran Gaia's relationship with the earth element could be seen from its name, so it could lead elemental creatures. Brando finally understood where the stone leopards came from. "Halran Gaia, Halran Gaia," the old man muttered to himself. Could this be the weapon of the giant Miguel? Brando nodded. Miguel was the most beloved son of Mother Earth, and the uncrowned king of the earth. In the legends, this sword was his scepter, and he used it to rule the earth. Of course, this was only a legend, but it made Brando's heart skip a beat. He took a deep breath and replied, "Those who come here will have the chance to obtain the sword through the challenge." He turned around and looked at everyone solemnly, "But there is a price to pay. If you fail, you will be turned into a stone statue and remain here forever. This is the meaning of the Arena of Destiny." In fact, Brando felt a headache coming on. The Arena of Destiny was one of the more difficult ancient quests. While he was having a headache, Coden asked, "How difficult is the challenge?" The old man looked at the sword and was a little tempted. Even though the old swordsman did not know where he was, but as the saying goes, the skilled are the bold. As a person who possessed the power of gold, he naturally would not be as scared as the miner who was still unable to utter a single word. "Very difficult," Medisha replied, "because this place exists between fantasy and reality, there is no limit to the difficulty of the challenge." Everyone's expression changed when they heard the words "no limit." "My lord, what about us?" Scarlet asked. The elven princess shook her head again. "There is no escape. Everyone has to challenge at least once before they have the right to leave this place." "Everyone?" The old man caught on to the word everyone. "Yes, unless you are iron ranked or below. You can only challenge alone, and not together." Scarlet's face paled when she heard the answer. Then, if someone fails, what will happen? She was powerless now, and it was almost impossible for her to pass the challenge. "You will be left here until the barrier disappears this time. You will be turned into a stone statue forever," Brando interrupted, "but as long as someone is willing to take on another challenge and succeed, they will be able to save their companions." Don't worry, Scarlet. My lord. The red-haired girl was slightly startled. She understood the meaning behind Brando's words, and could not help but look at Brando with a complicated expression. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 301. But just as everyone was whispering to each other, a loud voice boomed from the arena, interrupting Scarlet's words. Mortals, welcome to the Hall of Heroes. The voice was cold and dignified, as if it was filled with an unstoppable power. You will challenge your own destiny here. Whether it is for survival, or to become the ruler of the land, then, lowly challengers, step forth. Let us witness the birth of destiny. His voice reverberated in the arena like rolling thunder, causing everyone's faces to turn pale. Scarlet and Medisha turned to look at Brando, but Brando was observing the arena. He was trying to figure out what kind of challenges he might encounter. Destiny's arena had all sorts of monsters, but most of them were related to the environment of the arena. For example, in an ordinary arena like this, it was most likely that he would encounter powerful monsters on land or in the air. He sighed in relief. Thankfully, it wasn't the arena of the gods. The arena of destiny was one of the scariest arenas in the arena of destiny. Although the challengers weren't real gods, the creatures from myths and legends were enough to make one's scalp tingle. One by one, don't rush. I'll arrange the order. Brando looked at Scarlet. Scarlet, you and the miner will go together. None of you are iron ranked or above, so you can be counted as a group. It'll be easier for me to save you. Medisha was taken aback by Brando's words. She couldn't help but look at the red-haired girl in confusion. Who is she? I'll explain later, Brando replied. Old mister, you're next. What? Coden raised an eyebrow. Are you worried that I won't be able to pass? Brando shrugged and looked at Medisha. Medisha, come with me. Can I? You're a summoned creature, so you should be able to give it a try. Brando thought that if a summoned creature could enter the arena with him, then he would be able to pass the challenge. But before he could celebrate, the scenery in the arena changed. The fences on the walls rose, revealing rows of cages behind them. My lord. Suddenly, a person stood up from the cage. When she saw the others outside, she shouted anxiously, Medisa, Scarlet, I'm here. Brando's expression darkened when he looked over. The person in the cage was none other than the mercenary leader Yuta. Koen, Joka, and the rest of the people in the other cages also saw Brando. They all looked at him for help. Mister, can you help us? Joka shouted. Brendel did not say a word. He was not willing to help. He didn't mind, but if he wanted to help, he would have to go through at least 5 challenges. Based on this calculation, the highest level of challenge that he would face in the end would probably be the Mithril Sage. This was no laughing matter. From this point of view, the runic dwarves were clearly superior to the craftsmen of Buga. This was one of their prides. Brando knew very well that it would be difficult for him and Medisha to deal with a gold pinnacle existence. Although it was not impossible for them to win with the help of the wind spirit spiders, the chances were too slim. For this reason, he could only remain silent. Then the young man waved his hand and said, Xian, you go. Don't try to be brave, just admit defeat. Commander Yuta, she. Scarlet whispered. I'll save her, Brando replied. Go. The red-haired girl nodded. She gripped her lightning spear with one hand and dragged the miner who had fainted with the other into the arena. The stadium immediately erupted into thunderous cheers. Brendel listened carefully for a while before he realized that the audience was shouting Burning Claw. Burning Claw. Although he knew that this was just a product of fantasy and reality, he couldn't help but feel a little nervous. "Are you afraid, Medisha?" He turned his head and asked. "My lord," Medisha smiled, "I'm an undead." Brando immediately felt his face heating up. He didn't say anything else. Instead, he saw a giant door slowly open on the opposite side of the arena, and a terrifying monster leaped out from behind it with countless chains dragging behind it. It wanted to pounce on the red-haired girl in the middle of the arena, but it was held back by the chains. After a series of clanking sounds, it was forced to stop 20 meters away from Scarlet and let out a low growl. "What is that?" The old swordsman stared at the monster and asked. Brendel looked at the monster that was almost 2 stories tall. Its 3 heads collided with each other, and a thunderous roar came from its throat. Once it entered the arena, the entire arena was immediately filled with a foul stench, the smell of sulfur. "Cerberus," Medisha answered. "The demons under the sulfur river used to follow the dark dragon," the silver elf said in a low voice. "I've dealt with them on the battlefield before. They're very difficult to deal with." "What battlefield?" Coden looked at the elven girl with some doubt. He wondered what kind of battlefield would they fight with such terrifying creatures. But Medisha turned her head and smiled at the veteran who had participated in the November War, the Battle of the Holy Saints. The Battle of the Holy Saints. Coden was stunned. He instinctively thought that the little girl was joking with him. No matter how he looked at it, Medisha was a cunning little girl. Fortunately, it's not a Cerberus lord. It has the strength of a silver-ranked monster. "As long as we're careful, we should be fine," Brando said to Coden. "Be careful of its breath." "Kid, are you reminding me?" The old swordsman was stunned for a moment before he reacted. "I just don't want to save one more person." "Humph, that's because you haven't seen my true strength, kid," the old swordsman said as he stroked the hilt of his sword. "You should worry more about yourself." Coden said with a sigh in his heart. In fact, the old swordsman had been unlucky since the beginning. When he was about to make his move, he was interrupted by the landslide. Then, he was caught off guard by Medisha's sneak attack and almost died in the mining accident. For an experienced gold-ranked swordsman like him, it was too embarrassing. Even though he was injured, dealing with a silver-ranked monster shouldn't be a problem for him. Moreover, in the same class, be it magical creatures, monsters, or low-level demons, none of them could compare to intelligent beings. That was because apart from absolute strength, they had far fewer skills. The old swordsman had already made up his mind to vent his anger on these small fries. He even turned to Brando and said, "Do you want me to help you save someone, kid?" "No need," Brando quickly shook his head, thinking that the old swordsman didn't know what was good for him. The difficulty level of the Arena of Destiny would increase with each round. This time, it was a 3-headed Cerberus. Next time, it might even be a mountain giant. Coden snorted softly, as if he was dissatisfied with Brando's disdain. "What's your name, kid?" he suddenly asked. Brando was staring at the arena. When he heard the question, he didn't even hesitate to answer, "Sue." "Brando." He suddenly realized something and stared at the old swordsman. "What's the matter, old man? Do you want to remember my name so that you can settle accounts with me in the future?" To his surprise, the old swordsman didn't glare at him. Instead, he repeated the name twice, "Brando, Brando." Then he suddenly smiled mysteriously and didn't say anything else. Coden's reaction was completely out of Brando's expectations. He put his hand on his sword to prevent the old swordsman from acting rashly. After all, it wasn't a joke to cause trouble in the Arena of Destiny. Just as Brando was about to raise his guard, the situation in the arena changed. Scarlet immediately admitted defeat. Before the 3-headed Cerberus could break free from its chains, a white light flashed and she was sent to a cage not far away. "Scarlet." Yuta looked at her companion in shock. Scarlet red hair reminded her of her younger sister. She couldn't help but ask with concern, "Why didn't you resist?" "I'm sorry, I'm injured." The red-haired girl replied with a gloomy expression. Yuta frowned, "But you don't know the rules here. Every additional person will make it harder for the others to save them." She sighed and said in a low voice, "But it's fine. Whether that young noble will save us is still a question." "Nobles won't put themselves in danger." Scarlet sat down in the corner of the cage in despair. Compared to herself, she was more worried about her mercenary group. If anything happened to her here, Cornelius and Rabin wouldn't be so polite. But while she was worried, Scarlet didn't say anything. She grabbed the bars and looked towards Brando's direction. She didn't know why, but she knew that Brando would save them. Not only her, but Yuta as well. At this time, Brando was looking at the old swordsman walking towards the arena with a solemn expression. Coden held his sword in one hand and stared at the three-headed Cerberus without fear. But when he was about to leave, he suddenly turned around and said to Brando, "Humph, arrogant Tobu's brat. I'll show you what true swordsmanship looks like. I'll show you how arrogant you are." When Brendel heard this, he was stunned for a moment. Tobuz was his grandfather's name. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 302. Brando was stunned for a moment before he realized that Crone was a veteran of the November War. It was not surprising that he knew his grandfather. But Crone was born into a knight's family. The difference between him and his grandfather was like the difference between a nobleman and a commoner. How did they know each other? He decided to put this question aside for the time being. The battle had already begun, and the Cerberus seemed to be extremely displeased that its prey had disappeared from its sight. As soon as Crone stepped into the arena, the monster howled and struggled to break free from its chains. The chains that were as thick as a man's arm broke off one by one. "Damn it!" Crone thought to himself. He pulled out his sword and threw the scabbard away. The monster that came from the Sulphur River was already charging towards him, dragging the broken chains behind it. Crone raised his eyebrows and raised his eyelids slightly. His dark gray pupils reflected the demon that was charging towards him. He took a step back with his right foot, raised his sword with both hands, and roared, "You're too weak." Scram! A clear shockwave suddenly erupted from Coden's body in all directions, and the Cerberus in the air was swept away. The speed of the shockwave was comparable to that of a winged bullet. The shockwave was like a sharp knife as it shot forward for about 100 meters before it gradually weakened and disappeared. But before that, the Cerberus had already crashed into the wall on the other side of the arena. With a loud bang, countless bricks collapsed. Smoke and dust filled the air. Holy shit! Brando couldn't help but exclaim in his heart. This was a swordsman's blade burst. It was a type of swordsmanship. But to push the shockwave 100 meters away, how much did the core swordsmanship have to be? In the Amber Sword, all skills were divided into basic skills and skills. For example, White Raven swordsmanship and frontal assault relied on Brando's military swordsmanship. Power burst and charge relied on the three attributes of strength, constitution, and dexterity. The higher the level of the core swordsmanship, the stronger the constitution, and the greater the power of the skill. But at this stage, the blade burst had to be pushed 100 meters away. Brando had never heard of such a thing before. He remembered that he was around this level in the game when he was around level 80 to 90. Crone, on the other hand, was only level 45 at most. At this time, the Cerberus stood up from the rubble. It shook its three large heads, and sand and stones fell from its body and head. It looked like it was in a sorry state. But in reality, the Sulphur River demon wasn't seriously injured, especially when it hit the wall. If it was standing on the ground, it would have suffered a lot. But in the air, the resistance of the Cerberus was much lower. By the time it stood up, Coden was already right in front of it. The old man didn't use charge. Instead, he leaped across the sand like a bolt of lightning, covering a distance of 30 meters with each leap. Cerberus bared its fangs as it raised its head. Its big, wheel-like eyes had already caught sight of the approaching sword. There was no room for it to dodge. It didn't even have time to feel fear. With a loud bang, everyone saw the old man holding his sword with both hands, leaping high into the air and chopping down on the head of the demon that came from the Sulphur River. The tip of the sword went straight into the hilt and continued downward, splitting the huge head into two. Crone landed on the ground and swung his sword to the side. Black blood splattered on the sand. However, he immediately retreated, avoiding the fate of being sprayed by the stinky black blood. The Cerberus couldn't withstand the force and fell to the ground. However, the ferocious beast didn't give up. When Crone retreated, its two remaining heads each spat out a pillar of fire. The Cerberus was prepared for this, but he didn't expect the pillar of fire to have such a long range. Like a flamethrower, the pillar of fire covered half of the field. He quickly rolled to the side, but his clothes, eyebrows, and beard were all burned off. This accident made him tremble in anger. The beard that he had painstakingly grown out was his most precious treasure. Crone roared and charged at the Cerberus. He punched the chin of the Cerberus' left head. Everyone heard the crisp sound of bones breaking. But this wasn't the end of it. The immense force lifted the Cerberus, which was as tall as a one-story building, off the ground. The Cerberus' body weight was lifted by the Cerberus' left head. It was as if the Cerberus would fall back down and crush the Cerberus. However, Coden didn't move at all. Instead, he leaned forward slightly and swung his sword upwards from the hellhound's lower left hip, all the way to its upper right shoulder. With a loud tearing sound, the hellhound was split into two in midair. Black blood splattered and fell like raindrops. The two halves of the Cerberus' body fell to the ground. There was a moment of silence. Yuta, who was locked in the cage, gasped. Fear flashed in her green eyes. Amazing, she wasn't the only one. The youths in the other two cages were stunned. Their mouths were wide open, but no sound came out. The power of a gold-tier rancor was truly inhuman. When it was fully unleashed, it had an overwhelming impact. He's injured, Scarlet said, grabbing the bars with both hands. Otherwise, he wouldn't have to go through so much trouble. Yuta nodded. She knew that it was difficult for her to understand, but Scarlet, who had experienced it firsthand, knew better than her. Meanwhile, Joka, who was in the other cage, was whispering to the skinny youth beside him. Cohen, do you think they'll save us? Joka asked. The skinny youth shook his head. It's hard to say. I don't think so. Mar looked outside with a complicated expression. Why would they save us? We're not related to them. Besides, this isn't a joke. What will happen to us? Joka asked. The skinny youth shook his head again. I don't know. We won't be locked up here forever, right? Some of the youths were already crying. Can't you think of a way, Cohen? Joka was getting anxious. He didn't want to be locked up here forever. I'll try. Cohen looked outside and answered. Who's going to help you? Joka asked. The captain of the guards, of course. I heard that no one in Tonajul is a match for him. Someone said. Everyone looked at Cohen, but the skinny youth didn't answer. He looked at the arena. Brendel was not surprised by Coden's victory. He was more surprised by the old man's injuries. Why would a gold-ranked swordsman need to go through so much trouble to deal with a Cerberus? He turned his head slightly. How badly did you hurt him? The strike of 1,000 armies. Medisha answered softly. The youth wiped the sweat off his forehead. What kind of monster was Coden? How could he survive a strike of 1,000 armies? But Medisha quickly added, I didn't hit him. He dodged it, but he was hit by the wind and hit a rock. I followed up with another attack and he surrendered. He didn't have a strong will to resist. Brando suddenly remembered that Coden had shouted for him to stop. He realized that Coden must have recognized him from the start. He rubbed his forehead. How did Coden recognize him? His swordsmanship wasn't the same as his grandfather's. After the November War, Erwin's swordsmanship was reformed, but it was simplified by the players. But he didn't have time to think too much about it. The battle in the arena began again, and the old man challenged him again. The three-headed Cerberus corpse disappeared in a flash of white light. A fence rose from the southwest, and a fully armored dwarf walked out from behind it. When the sound of heavy footsteps could be heard, the silver elf princess suddenly said, My lord, I know this person. Brendel looked at the dwarf who was covered in heavy plate armor and had a four-horned helmet on his head. He carried a warhammer that was almost half his size on his shoulder. The symbol of a burning fist was painted on the warhammer and said, That's right. That's right. That's right. I know him too. Lord Evalian. He's a very famous lord among the Grey Dwarves. He was once a slave of the Rune Dwarves. But this is only an illusion, not the real person. He added, he's about as strong as a gold-ranked dwarf. Coden is in trouble now. Medisha didn't answer. Instead, she looked at her master curiously. She knew that Brando was a planeswalker, but a planeswalker wasn't a prophet. There was no doubt that Brando knew a lot of things that he shouldn't have. The history of the Rune Dwarves had long since turned to dust. Not to mention the humans, even among the Bugle Wizards, only those old men with white beards and glasses who buried their heads in books all year round could understand some of the secrets between the Silver Elves and the Rune Dwarves. But just as Brando said, Coden was in trouble. Evalian wasn't as agile as him, but the old man couldn't pose any threat to the dwarf. Evalian's warhammer was called Raging Flame, and when it was swung, everything within a radius of 20 meters would be covered in a firestorm. Coden tried to attack a few times, but in the end, his beard and eyebrows were burned into a mess. The battle was in full swing, and everyone, especially the youths in the cage, had their hearts in their throats. In their eyes, this old man was their hope, but now this hope was in a bitter battle, and this made their confidence waver for a moment. This was only the second battle. In the end, Coden was forced into a corner by Evalian. Both sides had similar battle experience. Evalian's illusion represented his heyday in the gladiator arena, while Coden was a veteran who had survived the November War. However, the Grey Dwarf Lord was obviously more energetic, and his excellent magic armor gave him a huge advantage. The dwarf let out a roar and finally used his most powerful attack. His warhammer was ignited in flames, and he swung it towards Coden like a meteor. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 303. Ah! The girl beside Cohen let out a low cry. On the other side, Scarlet's eyes flashed with confusion. The old swordsman did not retreat. Instead, he raised his sword and clashed with Varian's hammer for the first time. Ding! An ear-piercing sound pierced through the entire arena. Everyone could not help but close their eyes and cover their ears subconsciously. But the next moment, the youths in the cages were shocked to see Coden sweep Varian's hammer away. Everyone had only one thought in their minds: this is impossible. Brando's heart skipped a beat. He knew that Coden had been hiding his strength all this while, waiting for this final blow. But what really surprised him was that when the old man attacked, only he and Medicis saw a flash of blue light on the old man's right index finger. Wind bullet. Brando looked at the ring on his right index finger. Although the ring of the Wind Empress could be found all over Wound, this was too much of a coincidence. He was distracted for a moment and missed the moment when Coden took off Varian's helmet and stabbed him in the throat. When he came back to his senses, the dwarf lord's corpse had turned into white light and disappeared. However, the old man did not have it easy either. His hasty attack had caused him to suffer a punch to his chest. Varian's gauntlets were full of metal spikes. Not only did the punch penetrate and injure his lungs, it also caused his chest to become a bloody mess. But the worst part was the exhaustion of his physical strength. After the victory, the old swordsman could not hold on anymore. He supported himself with his sword and panted for a while before he recovered. Then, Coden pointed outside the arena, and one of the cages with the youths in it opened. "Come out, Joka." "Why are you here?" the old swordsman asked, panting. "Captain Coden." The youths were stunned. They did not know what to do. They did not understand why Coden would save them first. What they did not know was that this guard captain was not with Brando in the first place. The old swordsman coughed. His injuries were very serious. If it had been anyone else, they would have died. However, he wiped the corner of his mouth with the back of his hand. It was full of blood, but he didn't care. "All right, go to the side and stay there." He waved his hand at the youths. "What does this have to do with you?" "I'll ask you later." Joka and Mar were speechless. Although Coden had saved them, they had been captured in 2 batches. Cohen and his companions were still trapped in the cage, but it seemed that Coden had only saved them to find out what had happened. Furthermore, it seemed that the old guard captain did not intend to challenge them again. In fact, everyone knew that the old man did not have the ability to continue fighting. Even though Mar and Cohen often mocked each other, these youths had deep feelings for each other. It was hard for them to accept giving up on their companions. So what if it was hard to accept? They were powerless and could only stand there at a loss. "You guys go first, Joka." The skinny youth didn't seem to be panicking as he spoke to his companions. "Cohen. Take as much as you can. As for the rest, I'll think of a way myself." "What is it?" Joka asked. "I don't know." Cohen answered honestly. Coden did not care about what the youths were saying. He only knew Joka and Mar because he was familiar with them. However, in his eyes, they were nothing more than a bunch of hoodlums from Shaflun town. They weren't worthy of his attention. "Mortal, do you want to continue the challenge?" A loud and majestic voice boomed across the arena. "No." The old man refused the next challenge and limped to the side of the arena. At the same time, he shouted at Brendel, "How is it, Tobu's boy?" Brando looked at him and shrugged. The old man walked over and threw his sword to Brando. "Take this. I'll lend you this. It's your turn now. Let me see if that stubborn old man's descendant has improved." He then looked at Brando from head to toe. "You're his son." He shook his head. "You don't look like it. Grandson. But you look like you're in your early 20s, and you're already a gold ranker. You're not any weaker than that bastard. Humph, the son of a general doesn't have a dog." Coden shook his head as if he was lamenting the fact that he didn't have a descendant. Brendel's hand almost dropped the sword he had just caught. What did he mean by, "You're already a gold-ranked swordsman, and from this point alone, you're not inferior to your grandfather"? He never knew that his grandfather was a gold-ranked swordsman. No, wait a minute. According to Coden's words, he was far from being a gold ranker. He knew that he was able to become a gold ranker in half a year because of his cheat code. But if his grandfather also became a gold ranker in his 20s, he would at least be a seer. Brando slapped his forehead. He couldn't accept this information. In his memories of this world, his grandfather's family moved to Brags from other places. As for where they came from, he didn't know, and Brando never asked. He only knew that his grandfather used the money he brought to buy a piece of land in Brags, and then built a mill in the outskirts of Brags. Although he didn't come from a rich family, he didn't live a poor life. Otherwise, a young man like Brando would have either worked in the fields or become an apprentice. It was impossible for him to live alone in Butchie. Now that he thought about it, his grandmother didn't seem like a normal girl. Not only was she literate, but she also knew many things. His mother was from Kaliga, and came from a noble family. Her status was even more prominent. To be honest, Brando had never wondered why a noble's daughter would marry his father. No matter how rich a miller was, the gap between his bloodline and his status was difficult to cross. When Brando thought about it, he suddenly realized that the soul in his body didn't seem to understand his family and background. He suppressed his doubts and raised his eyebrows. "You know him?" "I've known him for a while." "That stubborn old man," the old man replied. "At that time, I was just a young man about your age. I just came out from the countryside of Togo. I said I was a knight, but I was just a wild boy. Your grandfather, on the other hand, graduated from a nobleman's academy. I was his subordinate for a period of time." He wanted to continue speaking, but at this moment, a loud voice above the arena interrupted their conversation. "Next challenger." Coden raised his head and looked at the sky above the arena. Brando also stopped thinking about it. A person could meet all kinds of people in their life, but only a few people would leave an impression on you after a few decades. Usually, you would remember them through a small connection. He guessed that their relationship wasn't as simple as what Coden said. He looked at his right index finger and saw 2 identical rings. This made him even more suspicious. When he was in Butchie, he had his suspicions. No matter how ordinary the ring of the Wind Empress was, it wouldn't fall into the hands of an ordinary miller. When Braggs asked the cripple about it, the latter's strange attitude made him suspicious as well. His suspicions were put aside for a while, but today, with the old man's reminder, it resurfaced. He looked at Coden and thought that as long as the old man was still in his hands, he would have plenty of opportunities to find out more. It seemed that he, or rather, Brando's grandfather, wasn't a simple person. Then, Brando and Medisha looked at each other and said in his mind, "Let's go." The Silver Elf Princess replied in her mind, "Yes, my lord." The 2 of them walked to the arena side by side. As they walked, the entire arena fell silent. 2 people. The youths were fine, but Janna and Coden were stunned. They knew Brendel and Medissa's strength, and they were at least gold-ranked. No matter how they looked at it, this was against the rules. "You too." The old man hurriedly called out to them. Brando didn't answer. Medisha didn't say anything either. She followed the young man to the center of the arena. The 2 of them stood there and waited quietly. However, Coden quickly guessed the origin of the Silver Elf Princess. He suddenly remembered that Medissa's elemental power was soul when they fought. However, there was only one kind of existence in this world that used souls as elemental power, and that was Madara's undead. Undead. The old man was suddenly enlightened. No wonder Medissa was so reckless during the landslide, because the undead had no fear at all. However, why would this young man have an undead following him? Coden's first thought was that he was a necromancer, but that was obviously wrong. First of all, a gold-ranked necromancer couldn't summon an undead of the same level. Secondly, Brando's eyes didn't have the purple or green light that represented soulfire. Coden suddenly gasped. A heroic spirit. He immediately guessed that Brando was a trainee Knight of the Flame. The Flame Knight was the strongest fighting force in the Holy Cathedral of Fire. It was a level 11 organization. Every Flame Knight was accompanied by the soul of an ancient hero from the War of the Holy Saints. These heroes were all knights who had once followed the Flame King Gretel. According to the Pale poem, the Flame King Gretel had 232 knights. Because of this, the Flame King Gretel never had more than 200 knights. However, he immediately shook his head. There were no silver elves among the knights that followed the Flame King. While the old man was puzzled, the youths at the side of the arena were whispering to each other. "It's over," Joka sighed when he saw Brando and Medisha enter the arena. "Can you stop being so discouraging?" "What do you mean it's over? The fight hasn't even started yet." Mar frowned when he heard his companion's words. He wasn't sure if Brendel would save Cohen or not. "Did you forget?" Joka turned around and said, "If you're stronger than that Iron Knight, you can't fight together." "What does that mean?" Mar was stunned. This meant that Brando wasn't strong at all. They couldn't help but look at Cohen in the cage. The skinny youth's face was expressionless, but the girl beside him was gloomy. "Damn it, I didn't expect this guy to be an embroidered pillow," Mar said angrily. "He looks good, but he's useless." "I thought he was strong." "Didn't you always say he wasn't strong, Mar?" one of the youths whispered. However, this sentence naturally received a fierce glare from the tall youth. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 304. No matter how sharp Brando's ears were, it was impossible for him to eavesdrop on the conversation of a few normal youths. Moreover, he was trying to familiarize himself with the sword in his hand. It was a magic sword, but it was a very common one and was slightly lighter than the average sword. This sword is at most a low magic item. I've used similar swords before, but I don't remember their names because I've used them over the years. The young man casually swung the sword, and the wind swept out left 2 shallow marks on the sand. Coden's eyes lit up when he saw this. It really is the White Raven swordsmanship. Coden had recovered from his shock, but he immediately raised his eyebrows. The White Raven swordsmanship is one of the most secretive swordsmanship in Erwin's palace. How did this kid learn it? He thought to himself. However, the youths also saw the same thing and began to argue. What is he doing? Mar asked with a frown when he saw the white light on Brendel's sword, and the sand around him was also covered in smoke. He's creating smoke, right? Joka replied with uncertainty. He's looking for an opportunity to defeat his enemy in the smoke. Don't you know that, Mar? He can't see anyone in the smoke, can't he? Joka was stunned for a moment before he rolled his eyes. Then there must be some sort of special technique. Why else would someone create trouble for themselves? It's easy to figure it out, however, Cohen interrupted them. He looked for a long time and finally confirmed it. He is familiarizing himself with the sword. Familiarizing himself with the sword. That sword was given to him by Captain Coden, someone said. But was it really okay to change swords before the battle? Even though the youths had not seen much of the world, they knew that it would affect the outcome. They could not help but look at the battlefield. Brando had stopped what he was doing and seemed to be ready. Medisha stood behind the youth with a silver shuttle in her hand. Because they were deep underground, her unicorn did not follow her. However, even on the ground, the Silver Elves' ancient battle techniques were not inferior. Coden had experienced it before, so he didn't dare to underestimate this little girl. The gate to the north of the arena opened once again. Behind it was the same 3-headed hellhound that had died once before. This giant beast's claws were on the ground, and its 3 heads were letting out low growls. Its 3 pairs of blood-red eyes were looking around, as if it was looking for its previous enemy. Its appearance caused a wave of low sighs, as if no one had expected this thing to come back from the dead. And this time, with the previous experience, the monster from the Sulphur River seemed to have learned its lesson. It waited for the owner of the arena to release it from its chains before it shook its black and red fur and entered the arena. It sniffed and revealed a cautious expression. It circled around and slowly approached Brando and Medisha. Everyone else thought that the dog had learned its lesson, but Coden smelled something unusual in the air. The old man stared at the center of the arena, his nose twitching. He couldn't help but frown and complain, "This little guy doesn't know how to control his aura. The whole arena is shrouded in his aura." Compared to him, the little girl is much gentler. His frown deepened. "But what is this smell? An element? What kind of element is this? It's strange." The surroundings were getting colder and colder. Frost had even appeared on the sand on the walls. The flow of the air seemed to have stopped, as if the entire place was filled with a sense of stillness. Even the youths who were dozens of meters away felt as though they had lost their footing and were stuck in a quagmire, let alone Cerberus, who was right in front of him. The youth stared at the dog's 6 large blood-red eyes with a calm expression. However, the latter did not feel so good. The hellhound felt as if there was a heavy mountain pressing down on its body, and its front and back paws were shackled firmly. Not to mention attacking, it could not even take a single step forward. The hellhound subconsciously lowered its 3 heads, as if it wanted to resist this unstoppable force. Coden was slightly surprised. At this moment, the words stability and stillness were clear in Brando's mind. He felt as if he could touch the rules. Just like when he fought against Cabias, he felt as if the power of his element was in his hands, and he could use it at any time. He knew that this feeling was just an illusion. Compared to the gold stage, the power of his element was like a trigger that could not be controlled. But now, this trigger had been triggered. Everyone, including the youths, felt that something was wrong. They saw the 2-story beast kneel down in front of Brando. The demon's limbs and chin were on the ground, as if it was a subject submitting to its king. It had no choice but to submit because the immense power made it unable to move. The young man stood there motionlessly, looking at the other party, as if he had accepted this kind of submission with a clear conscience. Everyone was stunned by this scene. Coden was even more stunned. What kind of element was this? Was it the aura of a king? Medisha, go. But Brando only said one sentence. Unlike everyone else, he felt a powerful force roaring in his heart, roaring to dominate everything. It was as if a terrifying beast would break out of its shell at any time. He even had the illusion that if he raised his hand, the world would collapse. It was as if he had the power of a god. Then, the silver elf princess moved. The silver shuttle in her hand turned into a silver line that extended forward, the tip flashing with the cold light of death. Time seemed to be stretched by this attack. Everyone saw the simple silver line draw a semicircle around the arena, and then slowly approach the hellhound from one side. As long as it was moving forward, it could pierce through the demon's 3 heads. But at the last moment, under the pressure of the aura of death, the hellhound finally broke free from Brando's element. It used all its strength to raise its head and jump back. It had clearly avoided the fatal blow. But a strange thought flashed through Brando's mind. It was as if the entire world was under his control. With just a thought, he pulled the beast back. With a soft sound, Medisha's small body raised the spear. The silver shuttle pierced through the 3 heads and pulled the unlucky hellhound up high, throwing it forward. Its corpse fell to the sand with a loud thud. It was a one-hit kill. The youths, including Mar, were all stunned. Coden thought he heard his own jaw drop to the ground. The old man couldn't help but touch his chin to make sure that the item was still in his body. He couldn't be more shocked by the element of space. That's... Joka felt as if something was stuck in his throat. The rest of his sentence was stuck in his throat. But no one laughed at him. Everyone was the same. Brendel noticed this as well. He looked at his own hand and was a little uncertain. Whether it was spatial lock or time stop, they were infinitely close to the element of existence. However, Medusa had already returned to his side. "My lord?" she asked in surprise. She was the one who had attacked, so she felt it more than anyone else. Brando waved his hand. He couldn't be sure. At this moment, a voice boomed above the arena. "Mortal, do you wish to continue?" "Of course," the young man replied with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Varian quickly entered the arena. "I'll do it this time," Brando said. He could feel that his control over his element was fading as he passed his peak. He had to test it out as soon as possible to confirm his suspicions. Medusa looked at him and guessed his intentions. She nodded slightly. Brendel put down his sword with his right hand and walked towards the Duergar. His cold aura once again pressed down on the Duergar. Varian was startled and snorted softly. The Grey Dwarf immediately threw away his arrogance and pretended to be relaxed in order to put pressure on his opponent. His two beady eyes sparkled under his helmet as he solemnly took down his warhammer from his shoulder and held it with both hands. He then shifted his center of gravity and entered a battle stance. This time, even Joka could see it. It was a beast's instinctive reaction to danger. But was that young man really that scary? He stared at Brendel carefully. He could not imagine that the young man whom he had dealt with, who had a somewhat easygoing attitude, would be dangerous enough to make this dwarf who was like a steel fortress nervous just by looking at him. He might be strong, but he's still so young. Joka recalled his own experience. Brando's reaction was similar to the guards in the mines. He thought that their strength should be about the same. Although that was already very strong in the Duergar's eyes. But he immediately knew that he was wrong. Brando had already attacked. In order to seize the opportunity, the young man charged forward. In the eyes of the others, it was unbelievably fast. They couldn't even see Brando's trajectory. They could only see his figure disappear and reappear in front of Varian in an instant. There were even ripples in the air behind him. The Duergar was startled, but his rich battle experience made him raise his warhammer with both hands to block. But his movements froze at this moment. Brendel's sword passed through his defenses like an illusion, passing through the gap between his helmet and breastplate, and piercing through his throat. The Duergar widened his eyes and only had time to let out a soft crack. Brando stopped in front of the Duergar like a ghost. He pressed one hand on the Duergar's warhammer and pulled back his sword with the other. The Duergar fell to the ground with a loud bang. Black blood slowly spread out from the Duergar's body. P.S. Thank you for your support. Did you like the latest chapters? To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 305. Black blood slowly seeped out from the dwarf's body. If a needle were to fall from the sky at this moment, it would definitely make a ding sound when it hit the ground. Everyone would be able to hear it. Even the cheers in the arena stopped. Joka made a sound in his throat and turned to look at Mar. Mar also turned to look at him, and both of them saw the same look of disbelief in each other's eyes. Who is this young man? No matter how ignorant Joka was, he could tell that Brando was no ordinary person. But at this moment Brendel's heart was like a stormy sea. After the incident at Abbey's castle, this was the second time he had entered an indescribable state. Time and space seemed to come to a standstill. The third definition of the elemental law appeared in his mind, but it felt like it was separated by a thin piece of paper. He could vaguely feel that it was also two laws. But the opportunity was fleeting, and when he reached out to grab it, the sound returned to the arena. The noise drowned out everything, and everything returned to normal. Brando was stunned for a moment before he sighed. It was still too early. If he was an intermediate gold, he would have entered the second stage of the elemental wall. But everyone was the same. Not everyone would enter the elemental wall immediately after reaching the peak of gold. The understanding of the laws was very important, and there were many geniuses who stayed in the gold realm for their entire lives. Not everyone was smart enough to understand the world, and sometimes it was easier to see the essence of the world without distractions. Brando also knew that this was a matter of appearance. He did not expect too much from things that depended on appearance. He could just rely on the ancient stone slab to break through the elemental wall. Unlike most people, the young man had a lot of ideas. But no matter what, this was not a bad thing. Just like now, Brando felt that he had a deeper understanding of stability and quietness. He could now confirm that these were related to the elemental wall. He looked at the sword in his hand. It was the sword that Coden lent him. There was a layer of transparent ripples on the blade. Elemental power, indestructible. Accuracy increased by 20%. Speed increased by 100%. Additional 10% cold damage. He immediately identified the transparent ripples on his retina. This was the power of the elemental wall. Although it was not complete, at least it had gone from hidden to dominant, just like Scarlet's lightning elemental power and Medicia's soul energy. In fact, in terms of strength, Brendel was now on equal footing with Scarlet and Medica. But in terms of actual combat strength, he was far inferior. Brendel glanced at Coden and thought that he might be able to fight against a gold-ranked fighter. If he remembered correctly, the first obvious bonus of the lightning element was attack extension, 20% increase in speed, and 30% additional lightning damage. This was the difference. Elemental power of the elemental wall. In the Amber Sword's elemental power, elemental power, elemental power, elemental power. In the later stages of the game, only the guild leaders of the major guilds or the famous RMB warriors in the entire server managed to level up through the Cocoon Transformation quest. However, Brando realized that his identity as an NPC allowed him to avoid this restriction. Space element. He really wanted to pour a bucket of water over himself to calm down. But at this time, a loud voice rang out again, interrupting his thoughts. "Mortal, do you wish to accept the next challenge?" Because of this voice, everyone focused their attention on Brando in the middle of the sand. Previously, they couldn't believe it, but now they suddenly realized that this young man had the ability to save them. In fact, it had far exceeded their expectations. Mars still could not believe that Brendel was stronger than the old guard captain, and he did not look like he was just a little bit stronger than him. Under their watchful eyes, Brando snapped his fingers to open the cage that held Yuta. Then, he nodded. Thus, the challenge entered the next stage. "My lord." Medica leaned over and looked at the young lord with her pale silver eyes. As someone who was born in the era of the War of the Holy Saints, the little princess didn't think that the Gold Realm was anything to be surprised about. Whether it was humans or silver elves, it was almost natural for them to reach the Gold Realm before the age of 20. However, as someone who had experienced this stage, she still asked with concern, "How is it?" Of course, she knew what happened to Brando before. Brando didn't say anything, but raised his sword and showed it to the silver fairy princess. Ah! This time, Medica was shocked. Space element. What? Brando raised his eyebrows. He caught the surprise in the girl's tone and couldn't help but ask, "Shouldn't space element be very common in your era?" In his understanding, the War of the Holy Saints was the era where monsters ran rampant. There were also geniuses of the level of Tumen, so wasn't it common for a space element to appear? One must know that in the later stages of the Amber Sword, although space and time were rare, there were still more than a dozen players. How? Medicia's eyes widened in confusion. Back then, only the wizard leader of the Silver Alliance, the founder of the Tower of Stars and Moons, known as the last sage on Earth, Arkith, had space element. Earlier, only the Dark Dragon had it. The girl added. Ha! Brando sweated. To be honest, although he knew a lot about the background of the game, it wasn't as detailed as someone who had experienced it. Medicia's explanation was refreshing, but he couldn't help but think to himself. It turned out that the Amber Sword still compromised with the gameplay in the end. He couldn't help but feel embarrassed when he thought of the number of players who had the highest element in the hundreds. While the two were talking, the fence on the east side had risen. Everyone stared in that direction with their eyes wide open. The sound of neat hooves came from the shadows behind the fence, startling everyone. When the first enemy appeared in Brando's field of vision, he narrowed his eyes. It was a knight, or to be exact, a tin man riding on a puppet horse. They held a round shield in their left hand and a spear in their right, surrounded by 4 colored runes. Type 4 Night Hunter. Brando whispered to Medicia. What's that? An invention of the Hazel people. Be careful, these things have the strength of a peak silver. Brando and Yuta, the female mercenary leader on the side of the arena, said this sentence almost at the same time. Hazel was in the middle of Wonde, on the border west of Cruz. The two countries were separated by a towering mountain range. The Hazel people were not the descendants of the sages in the War of the Holy Saints. It was said that they came from another continent. The residents there believed in the power of magical technology, so they had the largest army in the whole of Wonde equipped with firearms and artillery. Even in their army, there were tanks and old-fashioned aircraft. The Hazel people and Cruz people were at war all year round, but neither side had gained any advantage in a head-on battle. They could face the Eagle Empire head-on without retreating. This was a testament to the strength of this country. However, when Yuta said this, she had an inexplicable feeling in her heart. She looked at the open cage and thought that Brando should save Scarlet first. But the young man did not. He did not even look at her, which could only mean that he did not care who he saved first. Because he wanted to save both of them, it was the same no matter who he saved first. However, her words did not elicit a response from Scarlet. Instead, they were heard by the teenagers. The enemies were at the peak of silver. They saw the metal knights coming out from behind the fence one after another. There were more than 30 of them. In the first round, the Hellhound was only at the peak of silver, but in the third round, the difference in strength increased by 30 times. So many. Someone whispered. Isn't this too unfair? Joka completely forgot that he thought it was against the rules for Brendel to bring Medicia and Medicia up together. How despicable. Mar could not help but grit his teeth. How dare they fight us with numbers? Brando caught the words and looked at the edge of the arena. Be careful of their spears, Brendel said to Medicia as he pointed at the metal knights. Be careful of their spears, there are firing mechanisms from the handle to the middle of the spear. There are actually 6 barrels, gun barrels. The fairy princess was puzzled. Brando suddenly remembered that magicite technology was only a thing of the past 200 to 300 years. He quickly explained, you can think of it as a crossbow, but it has a strong penetrative power. Although it is not too much of a problem for us, it will still hurt if we get hit. Also, you have to protect your eyes and throat. Medicia nodded. Also, the 4 runes on their bodies will switch. This means that they are switching their attack methods. Red means heat ray, blue means ice shield, green means acceleration, and yellow means rock cover. Just pay attention to the red, it is a long-range attack. Brando continued. Understood. The Silver Fairy Princess could understand magic, but she was still curious about the hazel's intricate design. Although the craftsmen of Bugo were powerful, they were not as intricate as the hazels. She then asked, "Do you have a strategy, my lord?" 2 gold-ranked warriors fighting against 10 silver pinnacle warriors was the limit. Of course, she and Brando were far more powerful than the average gold-ranked warrior, but it would still be difficult for them to fight against 30 silver pinnacle warriors. However, Brando shook his head, "Just protect yourselves. Leave the rest to me." The Silver Fairy Princess was stunned. She then saw Brando raise his hand and snap his fingers. The crisp sound echoed throughout the arena, and everyone felt the light above their heads dim. They subconsciously looked up. Then, he choked. Over 200 wind spirit spiders with shining holy swords blotted out the sky above the arena. That spectacular scene even caused the clamor in the surroundings to come to a halt. Outnumbered. Brando lowered his hand and looked at the youths in the distance. "That's my line. P.S. If you think it's good, please vote for it. Thank you." Chapter 306. What is that? Everyone maintained the same action. They raised their heads, opened their mouths, and did not blink, afraid that they would miss a single detail. In the sky, countless holy swords were arranged at equal intervals, shining with golden light. They formed a huge diamond shape, as if the stars were inverted. The wind spirit spider was like a sky blue pattern on the holy sword, fusing together with the blade. Naturally, the Type 4 hunter riders also saw this scene. These metallic creatures raised their heads, and their prismatic crystal vision reflected a huge threat, so they made a uniform choice. The sound of spears being leveled drew everyone's attention back to the arena. The 30 Type 4 hunter riders pointed their spears at Brando. The 6 black barrels on the base of each spear were aimed at the young man. "Careful!" Someone shouted from the other side of the cage, but no one knew whose voice it was. Along with the shout, the magic conduction system began to rotate the 6 barrels, and with the crisp sound of gears grinding against each other, long tongues of flame appeared on the spears, 30 tongues of flame. Tayuna. Ancient Elven language, spirit wings, a spray of bullets brushed past Medisha, and dust flew everywhere. The Silver Fairy Princess reacted immediately, and the first thing she did was to raise her spear. Spiritual power was born from her back, and with her movement, it spread out to both sides, forming a huge pair of wings made of light. The girl stood in front of Brando, and all the bullets were blocked by the hexagonal crystal lattice. For a moment, half of the arena was filled with flashing sparks, and the clanging sound was deafening. Everyone could not help but cover their ears when they saw this scene. The Type 4 hunter riders then turned their target to Medisha, who was the center of the spirit wings, but Brando had already raised his hand and pointed downwards. He stood on the other side of the arena, and pointed at the metallic knight, as if he was a commander giving orders. A buzzing sound came from the sky, and the holy sword began to glow, and then became white-hot. After the white-hot light lit up, it quickly gathered into a dazzling light at the tip of the sword, and in the next moment, thousands of arrows were fired. It was an unforgettable scene for everyone present. Koden, Joka, Koen, and Mar were all thinking about what was going to happen next. But even after exhausting their imaginations, they were still shocked by the spectacle of the next moment. Countless rays of light pierced into the ground in an instant. The air between the scorching light pillars seemed to have evaporated, giving people the illusion that the entire arena would be vaporized into ashes in the next moment. At that moment, Koden suddenly remembered a phrase that the crew's ancestors used to describe war in their pale poem, "We saw the clouds parting and the sky turning crimson red." Steel seemed to be burning as it fell from the sky. Golden rain pillars fell diagonally onto the ground, and all living things fell into a sea of fire. It was so fitting. Coden had experienced the November War and witnessed the destructive power of the wizards. They could even destroy an entire army with a wave of their hand. However, that was already in the past. Coden thought that he would never return to that nightmarish battlefield again. But now, this familiar scene brought out the nightmare that had been buried in the deepest part of his heart, a nightmare that he would only occasionally see in his dreams. Coden did not realize that his pupils were dilating, his eyeballs were trembling, and his breathing had quickened. He instinctively reached for his sword, but he grabbed nothing but air. Coden broke out in a cold sweat, and then he remembered where he was. He was still in shock. He looked at the flames burning between the sky and the ground, and he was shocked by the power of the wizards. However, the metal creatures in the battlefield were more sensitive than him. The Type 4 hunters' reactions were simple. They stopped attacking at the same time and turned the yellow runes in front of them. As they did so, the rocks under the horses' feet rumbled and rose from the ground to form a rock barrier. The golden beam of light then fell from the sky and hit the rock wall. The rain of light splashed like molten steel on the outermost layer of the magically reinforced rock wall. The rock layer below was burned red, but it did not fall apart. The youths who were watching this scene from afar opened their mouths wide. A battle of this level had already exceeded the limits of their imagination. Whether it was the destructive rain of light that fell from the sky or the rock defense that could block such an attack, it was enough to deeply shock them. Joka did not move. Mar subconsciously retreated until he hit the bars on the other side of the cage. When he realized that, his forehead was covered in cold sweat. There was a layer of golden light in the deepest part of Cohen's eyelids. He clenched his fists tightly and stared at the scene without moving. Unlike most of the people who were attracted by the beautiful magical effects, he was looking at Brendel, who was in charge of all of this. This is... Yuta grabbed the bars with both her hands. The rain of light seemed to have penetrated into the deepest part of her soul, causing her to tremble. Only now did she realize how insignificant she and her mercenary group were, and how laughable their persistence was. There was no reason for this young man to appear here. She understood that even in this old kingdom, this kind of power was worthy of respect. As long as he was willing, he could obtain more power and authority than he currently had under any faction. Groudon's territory was nothing more than a joke to the mercenary leader. She could not understand why someone with such power would choose to live in such a barren land. He was even willing to fight against Count Randner and Erwin's upper plane. Yuta suddenly realized that she could not think of a single possibility that could explain all of this. But she finally remembered that night when Groudon received all the rewards he deserved. That night changed the course of everyone's lives. The young man brought the little girl with him, and the determination in his eyes. He is an envoy sent by the heavens to raise a flag for everyone. When people gather under this flag, everything will change. Yuta suddenly remembered a passage in the Pale poem that described the Azure Night. She felt that this passage was very apparent. A few hundred years ago, this passage was also used to describe the late King Eric. The defensive spells of the Type 4 hunters only managed to buy them a brief moment of respite. As the second and third beams of light converged on a single point, the magical defenses quickly fell apart. The sturdy rock layer was vaporized by the high temperature, and the metal with a higher melting point was melted into molten steel that seeped out from within. The scene resembled the egg white that flowed out of a broken eggshell, but this egg white was a dazzling golden red and had a temperature of hundreds or even thousands of degrees. When the red-hot metal flowed onto the sand immediately crystallized and formed a smooth layer. In less than a minute, the beams of light disappeared one after another. When the last beam of light disappeared, the arena was dead silent. Smoke curled up from most of the crystallized sand. The destroyed, charred rock fortresses stood lifelessly on one side of the arena. There were no survivors. The Type 4 hunters had all melted into a pile of metal debris in their own graves. Even Metisha, who was on the battlefield, was shocked. The elven princess looked up at the rows of holy swords in the sky, and then looked at Brando. "Did we pass just like that, my lord?" She could not help but ask softly. "What else do you want?" Brando shrugged in annoyance. Judging from her tone, it seems like she still thinks it's not enough. If it wasn't for the fact that he was a planeswalker, these 30 over Type 4 hunter riders would have given him a hard time. But he put down his hand, feeling that it was too good to be in control like this. The only pity was that the attack power of the holy swords was still a little too low. The 3 beams of light combined almost couldn't penetrate the silver pinnacle defense. The arena was silent. It seemed that Brando's actions had made the builder of the sanctum feel embarrassed. The sudden silence made the young man secretly alert. He knew that the arena of destiny was not without the possibility of tailor-made difficulty. Because this place was built on a material foundation, in the words of the players, it was actually a kind of pain in the ass to challenge oneself. But after a moment of silence, a voice suddenly sounded in his mind. 3 challenges completed. Additional rewards received. Brando was stunned. I almost forgot about that. He couldn't help but want to slap his forehead. He had always been clear about the rules of the Arena of Destiny in the Amber Sword. The first challenge here was often mandatory, and although the second challenge was optional, there were no benefits. And only after 2 challenges, the player had the right to choose to challenge the core reward. The number of challenges required for the core reward was 2, which meant that if a person wanted to complete this dungeon, they would have to challenge it at least 4 times. And at most, there was no upper limit. Of course, the so-called core reward here was the Halran Gaia. Brando looked in that direction. If he wanted to get that sword, he would have to go through at least 2 challenges. And there was an additional rule here. That was, from the 3rd time onwards, every successful challenge would receive additional rewards. The rewards would get better and better, and even have the possibility of surpassing the core reward. But it was said that it would take at least 30 challenges, but that was a rule that players found out in the later stages of the game. Now, Brando didn't even dare to think about it. Do you want to receive the reward? Brando looked at the row of fluorescent words that appeared on his retina, and answered in his mind, of course. Please select your interface. Another row of words appeared. Brando was slightly stunned. He had never heard of such a thing as selecting an interface. He thought for a moment, and then continued to read. Sure enough, the green text changed again. General interface, Planeswalker interface, huh? Brando was dumbfounded. He had never heard of a game where there would be additional choices for quest rewards due to a change in class. Although there were different rewards for some quests, there was one point, and that was that they were originally there. They were not extra rewards after you advanced into a certain class. He looked at the 2 options and hesitated for a moment. But in the end, he decided to give it a try. Planeswalker interface. The scene changed again. Last night, I forgot to turn off the air conditioner when I went to sleep, and you all know the result. I'll be leaving today's update. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidien.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 307. The green text that was projected on his retina disappeared. Brando immediately saw a floating screen in front of him. To be exact, it was a roulette. Every engraving on the roulette corresponded to the painting of a card. He was slightly startled and understood the meaning of this thing. There were 170 slots in the outer circle of the roulette, and the cards were all ordinary bronze cards that corresponded to the elemental colors. There were 40 slots in the inner circle, and there was a layer of silver light on the surface of the cards. It was a rare silver card. However, the inner circle was now gray. Obviously, for some reason, it did not meet the requirements to unlock it. Brando's gaze returned to the outer circle. He looked at the cards one by one and found the one that he thought was the best. It was the Earth Elemental card, Bleeding Altar, in the north direction. A Bleeding Altar, Wolf's Lair 3, 25 Earth, 200 mana, enchantment, lair. You can sacrifice 5 gray creatures and summon Futai's the Earth Dragon into the field. Creature, Dragon Viper, level 50 boss. Whether Futai's dies or the enchantment is destroyed, this card will enter the graveyard. When Futai's is in the field, 1 gray creature must be sacrificed every day to maintain it. Not far away, a low roar came from the cave. Another card also caught his attention, Gem Plane, Scenic Wonder 6, Special Land, Plane, tap, 2 light into your elemental pool. Tap, pay 2 light, gain 20 wealth. No one knows what kind of natural gifts are left under the grass. This card was even more attractive to Brando than the first one because both the light element and wealth were resources that he urgently needed. Especially the former, he had no way to replenish it. On the contrary, he had a large number of cards that required the light element. For example, the Golden Battle Flag, 5 light, Sunblade, 5 light, Pristine Archangel, 5 light, and even the Archangel had to pay an additional maintenance fee for every day it was in the field. Since the night of the Battle of Abes, Brando had been using the light elemental pool as a part-time elementalist. Although he had been trying his best to save the little resources he had, he was only left with 6 or 7 light elemental pools. If he could get that card, his current predicament would be completely changed. He believed anyone would be able to see the difference between a one-time consumption and a sustainable use at a glance. Needless to say, the role of wealth was so important that it didn't need to be reiterated. But in fact, Brando would discover that he was not only lacking in wealth and light element. If he had carefully examined all the resources he had as a planeswalker, he would have realized that he didn't live up to his name. He had a total of 19 cards in his hand, including the event card, Wolf's Lair, which had already been used. Among them, there were 4 treasure cards, Holy Sword, Golden Battle Flag, Silver Colt, and Eternal Orb. 5 creature cards, Highland Squire, Wind Spirit Spider, Mercenary of Lopez, Unicorn Knight, Pristine Archangel. 1 resource card, Rich Gold Mine. 3 spell cards, Energy Drain, Sunblade, Sprint Drive. 5 land cards, Sacred Tree Secret Grounds, Ruagen Swamp, The Shire Market of Roe, Storm Lair, Ember Volcano. Event card, Wolf's Denver. 19 cards, not even half of a deck of cards. According to Tuman, a deck of cards must have at least 40 cards to be called a deck, and only such a deck could be freely switched in battle. In other words, if this wasn't Brando's first deck of cards, he wouldn't even have the basic qualifications to have 40 cards. In other words, he was just like a sorcerer's apprentice. At most, he was an unofficial planeswalker's apprentice. In theory, his 5 land cards could provide him with 2 nature, 1 water, 1 dark, 1 earth, 2 wind, and 1 fire. In addition, there would be an additional 1 water, 1 dark, 1 wind, and 1 fire every week. But the truth was that the rich gold mine was attached to the hidden grounds of the Holy Tree. In order to ensure the normal operation of the gold mine and maintain the more important wealth, the card of the hidden grounds of the Holy Tree was not used most of the time, and only provided 1 water EP per week. Fortunately, he only had the Shire as his water element card, and he didn't have any green cards, so at least he didn't feel that it was too difficult. But according to Tuman, nature cards had the best summon creatures of all cards, and Brando knew that he would have to face this problem sooner or later. In terms of financial income, he owned the market of the Shire of Roe and the rich gold mine. One was 8 wealth, the other was 4 wealth, a total of 12 wealth per day. But what he needed to pay was Unicorn Knight card, 6 wealth, 1 dark day. Lucas's Mercenary, 2 wealth per day. Highland Squire, 1 earth day. Pristine Archangel, 1 light day. It could be seen that under normal circumstances, Brando's dark and earth elements were equivalent to having no income every day. Dark elements were still fine because Metasha usually had a hard time entering the graveyard. But earth elements were necessary for Brando's other powerful card combination, Wind Spirit Spiders, Holy Sword, and the consumption wasn't just a little bit. Usually, it would take half a month to store enough for one battle. In order to save earth elements, Brando would rather shuffle the Shire back into the deck and summon it again every day. This was because summoning the Highland Squire only required 1 water, but maintaining the presence of the Highland Squire required 1 earth. But this wasn't without its disadvantages. First of all, he couldn't obtain the 1 reputation that the Highland Squire provided every day. Secondly, Brando's water element storage was decreasing day by day. His original plan of living off his previous savings would soon lead to the crisis of the elemental pool. In Brendel's opinion, this kind of a robbing Peter to pay Paul situation did not make him a qualified planeswalker. And before this, he had never regarded this class as his biggest reliance. Of course, it was more than enough as an additional support. But Brando could faintly feel the potential of the planeswalker class. He thought that perhaps this class would bring him a huge surprise in the future, or even become a life-saving asset. But he also understood that it would require an even larger deck to support it. This process was very long, but the prospects that were presented were very tempting. So when Brando saw the roulette, he couldn't help but say, "Interesting." He immediately tapped on the screen with some anticipation, hoping to get the card he wanted. The roulette immediately spun, and Brando's gaze was nervous and motionless. But after a few seconds, the needle slowed down. It first swept across the gem plane, which made Brando's heart tighten slightly. He was a little disappointed, but he immediately saw that the needle was approaching the north from the other side. At this moment, the arena was silent. Everyone saw Brando standing there motionlessly, frowning as he focused his gaze on an infinite distance in front of him. "My lord." Metasha turned her head and asked softly. But Brando turned a deaf ear. He saw that the needle was slowly passing the bleeding altar, and couldn't help but shout in his heart, "Stop! Stop!" But the disobedient needle still slid a little, just a little, but the card's appearance changed. Fireclaw Spearman, Flame Tribe 2, 15 Fire, Creature, Fireclaw Lizard Warrior, Level 27 Creature, Warlike. Place a company of Fireclaw Spearmen into the arena. When a Fireclaw Spearman is in the arena, pay 5 fortune per day. There's the smell of enemies in the flames. Lady Martha, don't be like this. Brando shouted in his heart, but he didn't show it. Instead, he watched as the roulette disappeared, and then a fiery red card floated from the air into his hand. Brando looked at the card. It was a drawing of a lizardman warrior. But unlike the lizardmen of Woned, these lizardmen with crimson scales were obviously much stronger. They wore simple metal armor, and 2 arm-length spears hung from their backs and waists. But what caught Brendel's attention was the lizardmen's golden prismatic pupils. Among the reptiles in Vaunt, those with golden pupils were a symbol of the dragon's bloodline, and it was a lesser dragon species that was very close to it. It seemed that these Fireclaw lizardmen's individual combat strength was only at the peak of Iron rank, but their background was not simple. In other words, their ancestors were once rich. Thus, the warlike attribute on the card was easy to understand. Dragons were famous for their warlike nature, and Brando didn't know anything else except this attribute. He knew that some monsters in the Amber Sword had a warlike attribute, which meant that when these monsters attacked or were injured, they would gain a morale bonus. This bonus wasn't easy to understand, but according to Brando's rough estimation, every morale bonus was equivalent to a 10% increase in overall combat strength. Overall, this buff was quite unobtainable. But this card made Brando feel a little uncomfortable. He felt that he needed a resource card, not a creature card. Not to mention that the summoning cost of the Fireclaw Spearman was as high as 15 fire, and the cost of maintaining it was close to the cost of the Unicorn Knight, but this card was inferior to the latter in every aspect. He flipped the card over and over again, and when he saw the sentence, "Put a company of Fireclaw Spearmen into play," he calmed down a little. According to Madara's calculations, a company of 30 people, and Erwin's company of 100 people. He didn't know how these Fireclaw lizard men were organized, but Brando felt that it shouldn't be too much of a scam. When the card was in his hand, it was not unsealed. With a slight thought, the card disappeared from his hand and entered his deck. This scene naturally fell into the eyes of Medisha and the other youths, but Coden, who was facing away from him, didn't see this subtle movement. "My lord." Medisha was also a summoned creature, but she didn't understand how Brando got a card out of nowhere. Brando regained his senses and quickly replied, "It's just a reward, let's continue the challenge." "Do you still want to continue the challenge?" The Silver Fairy Princess was stunned. Brando looked at the sword in the center of the arena and nodded. Ever since he lost the Thorn of Light, he had always wanted to find a suitable weapon, and he didn't want to give up this opportunity no matter what. Moreover, the Halran Gaia was indeed tempting. Thus, when the loud voice sounded for the third time in the arena, "Mortal, do you want to continue your challenge?" Brando nodded without hesitation. "I want to proceed with the advancement challenge." The young man looked at the Halran Gaia on the stone tablet and replied. The arena fell silent. Then, under everyone's astonished gazes, a huge cage slowly rose from the other side of the sand. A huge monster was locked in the cage, and everyone promptly shut their mouths. It was a dragon. Author's note, please support me. 1. In The Promise, Mansion said to Qingqing, "Cecilia Chung, you will never get true love, and even if you do, you will lose it immediately." 2. Wu Huan, Nicholas Tse, said to Qingqing, "Cecilia Chung, you have ruined my chance to be a good person." 3. Qingqing, Cecilia Chung, said to the millions of soldiers, "Do you want to see me take off my clothes?" Now, hundreds of millions of people around the world have seen it. 4. Chen Kaiga said, "You don't understand the promise now, but you will in the future." Chapter 308. To be more precise, it was a lesser dragon. When the draconic beast landed on the ground, it was as majestic as a fortress. Its color was sky green, and the edges of its scales reflected a cold light like steel. Each scale was a few inches thick, and from afar, it looked as if it was covered in a layer of metal. However, the draconic beast's true characteristic was its ugly, angular, triangular head. Its deep eye sockets had a pair of motionless, pale blue eyes. The only thing that stood out about the draconic beast was the golden flame of the draconic beast's descendant, the draconic wind Aedra. In front of the adult draconic beast, Cerberus was as obedient as a puppy. The draconic wind Aedra was at the top of the food chain in the mountain of quelling storms. The natives of that country called it the Overlord of the Wind. Legend had it that the draconic wind Aedra was the descendant of the sky dragon, the dragon of calamity. However, in Brando's previous life, the Royal Society of Naturalists in the Cruz Empire had already refuted this theory. The draconic wind Aedra was the descendant of the sky dragon, but it was different from the elves in the clouds. It was more of a savage predator, and the blood that flowed in its body was not the cold blood of the elements, but the warm blood of the wild. However, no matter what kind of blood it had, it would not be affected by the draconic wind Aedra's name. Even if the draconic wind Aedra in front of Brando was just an immature youth, it still had the strength of an upper gold. Damn it! Brando cursed in his heart. The draconic wind Aedra's true strength was that it was immune to all air spells. The Arena of Destiny must have scanned the wind spirit spiders before releasing this draconic wind spirit spiders. The draconic wind spirit spiders could be said to be one of their biggest natural enemies. This was blatant cheating. If it was in the past, Brando would have immediately disconnected and run to the forum to curse the designer. However, he could only accept it now. Fortunately, it seemed that the Arena of Destiny could only scan the draconic wind spirit spiders and not the other cards attached to it. This was because the attack attribute of the Holy Sword cards came from the Earth element, which was the most effective against air element creatures. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but be filled with the pleasure of revenge. However, unlike Brando's rich and colorful thoughts at the moment, when the others saw this mountain-like monster, they did not have many thoughts in their minds. Everyone sucked in a breath of cold air, and a kind of fear that seemed to tighten their heartstrings grew in their hearts. Even those who hadn't been out of Schaflund since they were young could at least recognize what kind of item it was. Dragons. Although they might not be able to tell the difference between the real dragons, sub-dragons, secondary dragons, and flying lizards in the Amber Sword, they undoubtedly had one thing in common, and that was that they all played the role of the final boss in legends or bedtime stories. Everyone grew up listening to the legends of dragons, whether it was the mythical dragons such as Dusk and Darkness, the sky dragons such as Azure, Blazing, and Crystal, or the fire-breathing dragons on the ground. There were too many stories to describe the power of these creatures. Moreover, as the last of the golden dragons on the ground, they had the blood of mystery and nobility flowing in their veins. Joka, Mar, and Cohen held their breaths. Even Yute, Scarlet, and Coden were stunned. They recognized Erwin's pterosaur as a military flying beast, but it was definitely not this thing. This was a gigantic beast that shone with a blue and green light. Its wings were like blades that cut the metal cage into pieces. So this is a dragon. They all thought at the same time. The only one who reacted was Mar. Perhaps he was born a little careless. He suddenly pushed Cohen aside and whispered, "He's challenging us again. Is he going to save us?" Cohen didn't say a word. He looked at the dragon, his heart pounding nervously even though he knew that they weren't its target. But in front of such a gigantic beast, ordinary people couldn't help but feel small. It was as if the dragon could easily kill them with a flap of its wings. Of course, it wasn't unreasonable to think that way. But even if the Aedra Wyrm was 100 times stronger, it still wouldn't be able to destroy the protective barrier around the arena. Cohen. Shut up. Cohen raised his voice for the first time. He frowned and shook his head. Although the Aedra Wind Dragon had attracted his attention, he was still thinking about the scene from before. That detail made his heart skip a beat. He put his hand into his pocket and pressed down on something. The Aedra Wyrm. Medisha tensed up. She pursed her lips and stared at the dragon with her silver eyes. She couldn't help but tighten her grip on the silver shuttle in her hand. No matter what, the Aedra Wyrm was an upper gold-tier monster. My lord, even though the Aedra Wyrm looks big and clumsy, it's actually very fast and agile, the Silver Elf Princess whispered. Before she could finish her sentence, the Aedra Wyrm suddenly spread its wings and soared into the sky. It was so fast that Brando could only see a faint green trail of its movement. By the time the young man realized what was going on, the Aedra Wyrm had already turned around and charged into the swarm of wind spirit spiders. The Aedra Wyrm was very familiar with these little creatures, but the holy swords on their bodies made it feel like Damocles was hanging over its head. The Aedra Wyrm's instincts were not wrong, but Brando's summoned creatures were in trouble. In the blink of an eye, the Aedra Wyrm noticed that a large part of its holy sword array was missing. Spread out. Shoot at will. Brando was so anxious that he immediately gave the order. 2 Earth EP was drained from his elemental pool, and a large golden net appeared in the sky. But what happened next was something that Brando would never forget. He looked up and saw the Aedra Wyrm swimming in and out of the net like a fish. More than 70% of the light beams missed the Aedra Wirm's body, and only a few hit the scales of the Aedra Wirm. It was as if the air was not an obstacle but another pair of wings for the Aedra Wirm. It wasn't just the young lord who was shocked. Everyone else was shocked as well. Even though it happened in the blink of an eye, it felt like 10,000 years had passed in everyone's eyes. The Aedra Wirm seemed to be moving in slow motion in the air. It rolled, and the light beams missed its wings. It dodged left and right as if it was so slow that even the naked eye could follow its movements. But the Holy Sword cards just couldn't hit it. The illusion disappeared in a blink of an eye. The Aedra Wirm had passed through the net of light and was now in front of another group of wind spirit spiders. This was the strength of a gold-ranked wind elemental creature. As expected of a creature from the wind elemental realm, Brando felt an inexplicable sense of beauty in his heart. He had heard of the wind elemental realm from the players before, but this was the first time he saw it with his own eyes. The Aedra Wirm's speed left a deep impression on him. They are the descendants of the Cloud Elves. They really live up to their name. Legend had it that the blue dragons were the ones who flew in the clouds. Their speed was comparable to that of light and lightning, but it was clear that their descendants were not inferior to them. Brando didn't have much time to think about it. If it was a gold-ranked creature on the ground, he, Medisha, and the wind spirit spiders would have a chance. But this time, the arena of destiny was giving him a hard time. Fortunately, this problem was not unsolvable for him. He took a step back and shouted, "Medisha, summon the unicorn." "Yes, my lord." The silver elf princess grabbed her spear and jumped up. The spirit unicorn immediately jumped out of a door of light that appeared out of thin air, allowing the girl to land on the saddle behind it. After one person and one horse became one, Medisa immediately rode the unicorn and soared into the sky to kill the wind dragon. Although the Aedra Wirm was as fast as lightning, the unicorn was not inferior to it. Unicorns were creatures with extremely powerful individual combat strength. Only silver elves could accompany them and make them willing to become mounts. Unicorns were a level 11 organization of the silver elves, and their individual combat strength was close to the peak of gold. Among them, the elderly had even activated their elemental powers. In fact, if it wasn't for the fact that Medisha was the only one who could fight in the Unicorn Knight card, her unicorn would be far more powerful than her. Of course, Brando knew that the rules of this card were limited. The only thing that the unicorn she rode on was its speed. But that was enough. The Aedra Wirm immediately sensed a threat approaching from behind. Although Medisha was only at the beginning of gold, if it exposed its back, it would suffer the same fate as Coden. It had no choice but to give up on the wind spirit spiders and turn around to face the silver elf princess. Both sides crossed each other in the sky. The Aedra Wirm had suffered a great loss from Medisa's counterattack, but even so, the one who was injured was Medisa. The Aedra Wirm used its claws to push away Medisha's spear and clawed back to force her away. The Aedra Wirm then took the upper hand. The whole process was done in one go, and it was unscathed. Even though the silver elf princess managed to dodge the fatal blow with the speed of her royal unicorn, the air currents around the Aedra Wirm still managed to inflict multiple wounds on her body and armor. This air current was one of the characteristics of high-grade wind elementals. The craftsman of Galbu even created a spell called Air Shield. However, compared to the original version, this spell only retained the defensive side. As for the offensive side, the girl on the unicorn touched her cheek, her palm was covered in pale silver blood. She looked up, and a hint of caution flashed in her eyes. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 309. The wind spirit spiders in the sky launched another volley of attacks. Golden beams of light crisscrossed in the sky, forming a magnificent net of light. Brando still had 3 Earth EP left in his elemental pool, but he immediately tapped the Shire of Rhodes and allowed the Holy Sword card to attack twice in the next 15 minutes. The Holy Sword's attack was not very effective. A single beam of light could barely penetrate the outer layer of the Aedra Wirm's magic defense, let alone penetrate its thick scales. The Aedra Wirm's speed was too fast for the wind spirit spiders to catch up to it. Brando realized that the wind spirit spiders and the Holy Sword combination had another fatal weakness. The Holy Sword's accuracy was dependent on the wind spirit spiders' attributes. However, the wind spirit spiders' levels were too low. Their dexterity and perception were too low, and their intelligence was too low. Although the number of wind spirit spiders could make up for this weakness, the remaining 100 wind spirit spiders in the sky were not enough to deal with the Aedra Wirm. The wind spirit spiders' speed was at least 300%. Even with Medish's help, the wind spirit spiders could barely contain the Aedra Wirm. Brando stared at the battle in the sky and took a step back. Another card appeared in his hand, the Silver Horse. He threw the card to the center of the battlefield and drew a magic circle on the ground. A shining silver horse leaped out of the circle. He knows how to summon. One of the young men shouted. Their eyes shone brightly. This battle was beyond their understanding. In their minds, if the Aedra Wirm was the most terrifying monster in the world, then Brando and Medisha were the most powerful people in the world. On the other hand, the old man did not express his opinion. Coden's attention was completely focused on the battle taking place on the battlefield. The November War might have been more gruesome and cruel, but it was not as magnificent as this one. On the battlefield, it was a battle of flesh and blood. But here, the battle was nothing more than a golden net in the sky, a dragon and a unicorn knight. The battle was filled with a kind of fantasy, and it also evoked the old swordsman's memories of the time when he was young and passionate. He touched the Wind Empress ring on his index finger, feeling a little emotional. Brando had already mounted his horse. He patted the silver horse's neck, and it immediately turned into a streak of light and charged towards the Aedra Wirm. The young man activated his charge skill in midair, and the speed of one man and one horse instantly caught up with Medusa's royal unicorn. With his sword in hand, he aimed at the wind dragon's belly, which was the weakest part of any dragon. Moreover, the wind dragon was a wild subspecies of dragon, unlike many of the second-generation dragons who were enslaved by the humans and wore chest and abdomen armor. The Aedra Wirm sensed the threat coming from below and blocked Medish's spear with one of its wings. It then turned its body in the air and swept its tail towards Brando. The Aedra Wirm's tail whistled through the air like a banshee's wail as it swept past Brando's head. The sharp air current around the tail cut off a strand of Brando's hair. The young man ducked to avoid the attack, but he also lost the opportunity to attack. The Aedra Wirm took advantage of the opportunity and swooped down towards Brando. A streak of azure lightning flashed across the sky. "Oh!" Jenna heard Scarlet's worried cry from behind her. She realized that she had unknowingly gripped the iron bars tightly. The mercenary leader let go of her hand awkwardly, but the battle in the sky still made her feel uneasy. She looked up anxiously. The Aedra Wirm's strength was beyond her imagination. However, Brando, who was under attack, did not think much of it. Brando had never fought a Aedra Wirm before, but he was quite familiar with the flying lizards. He did not hesitate to tighten the reins of the silver horse and stopped in midair. He then whispered an order to the silver elf girl. Medisha. Medisha, who was chasing after the Aedra Wirm, looked up and saw Brando's eyes from afar. She immediately understood what he meant. Brando raised his sword, and the wind spirit spiders around him received the order. They immediately attacked the area between him and the Aedra Wirm. The intertwining beams of light blocked the path of the Aedra Wirm that was swooping down towards Brando. The Aedra Wirm paused in midair, and at that moment, it was as if the wind in the air had stopped. The net of light became brighter and brighter, and even the Aedra Wirm and Brando could not see each other through the blinding light. The Aedra Wirm flapped its wings and could not move forward. Brando took a breather and checked his elemental pool. There were only 2 Earth EP left. He patted the silver warhorse's neck and allowed it to dive through the net of light. At the same time, another card of fate appeared in the young man's hand. The Aedra Wirm on the other side of the net did not see Brando's actions. In fact, it had a bigger problem to deal with. The wind spirit spider's sudden attack had stopped it in midair. However, the price of being interrupted was fatal. Even though it was only for a moment, Metasha and her royal unicorn still managed to catch up to the Aedra Wirm. Strike of 1,000 armies. Metasha held the silver spear in her hand tightly and thrust it forward. Her petite body was filled with terrifying power. Her spear, her horse, and her spear pierced through the air. The silver line pierced through the Aedra Wirm in an instant, causing it to let out an anguished wail that shook the entire arena. Although it tried to dodge the amazing spear at the last moment, the Silver Elf Princess Knight's spear produced a strong suction force in the vacuum area and pulled it back. The spear first pierced through the Aedra Wirm's outer layer of magical defense. Then, it parted the sharp air current and shattered the blue scales on the Aedra Wirm's back. Blue blood burst out in the air and fell like rain. However, it evaporated halfway and formed a light blue cloud in the air. This was one of the main characteristics of air elementals. Air elementals were made up of wind elementals. When the wind elementals dissipated, they would return to the world in a free state. The Aedra Wirm almost lost consciousness due to the excruciating pain. The strike of 1,000 armies was a slow but powerful elven battle technique. Even though Metasha was 2 ranks lower than the Aedra Wirm, she was still able to inflict serious damage to it. While the Aedra Wirm was falling, Brando and the Silver Warhorse had already passed through the light blue clouds in the same direction. He looked up at the Aedra Wirm that was falling towards him and raised the card in his hand. "Show me," he shouted. The card in his hand depicted a group of charging knights. As soon as Brando let go of the card, it flew into the air and emitted a blinding light. Card of Fate, Sprint Drive enters the arena. Planeswalker pays 2 Earth Elementals. Summoner and Unicorn Knight receive Link ability. Shared power and shared damage. At that moment, Brendel felt his strength increase exponentially, more than doubling in an instant. He activated the Crystal of the Ghost Knight and activated Power Burst. In a split second, the exchange ratio between stamina and power burst was pushed to the highest level. It seemed like a simple slash, but the White Raven Sword style's wind blade instantly shot out. When the wind pressure compressed the air to form a sharp current, the distorted airflow refracted the light and instantly drew a crescent-shaped arc of light with a vertical width of nearly 30 meters in the air. The arc of light moved forward and expanded further, covering half of the sky under a 100-meter-long crack. Time seemed to have stopped for a moment as the sword's splendor that flickered with a faint silver light stretched across the sky. In the eyes of everyone who looked up at this scene, it was like a sword that tore through space. Mid-level gold. At that moment, the old man froze like a stone statue. He did not know what kind of sorcery Brendel had used, but the young man's strength had skyrocketed in such a short period of time. The scene of him breaking through to the gold-ranked realm was real. Even in the entire world of Wond, it was rare to see such a sudden breakthrough. At that moment, Coden could not help but associate Brando with the rare golden bloodline. He could not help but wonder if the stubborn Tobu's ancestor came from a family with a long history. With a loud bang, the Aedra Wind Dragon landed in the middle of the arena, stirring up a cloud of dust. Everyone felt the floor shake. But no one said anything. Everyone, including Scarlet and Jutta, were stunned. Not only was the intensity of the battle far beyond their imagination, but the speed of the battle was also far beyond their imagination. From the moment the Aedra Wind Dragon was sent flying to the moment it was killed by Brando and Medisha, only half a minute had passed. After a long while, the young miners finally heaved a sigh of relief. After the battle, the arena was filled with a strange silence. On one hand, they were subconsciously recalling the battle, but on the other hand, they were hoping that Brando would help them. Unfortunately, they were disappointed. Brendel did not even look at the screen as he continued to draw the lottery. This time, the young man got what he wished for. When the green text disappeared from his retina, a gray card fell into his hand. Gem-plain Brando clenched his fist, his heart filled with satisfaction. He looked down at the arena and said, "Prepare for the last battle, Medisha." "Yes, my lord." The silver elf girl leaned over and lowered her head. The next match will be the arena battle, Brendel thought to himself as he knew the rules of the Arena of Destiny. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.